Well, one thing I found out about you, which I hadn't known before, that you appear to have been born in South Africa. Is that right?
That's right, yes. I think if it hadn't been for the Boer War, I wouldn't have existed.
How was that?
Well, my father, who was a curate in Bromsgrove, went out to do his bit and became a curate in Wynberg, where he met my mother, who was the daughter of Colonel John Eustace, who had gone out there to make his fortune after serving in the Crimean War. And there he met my mother, met his wife, and produced my mother, who married my father.
That was, you were born in 1905?
So I was born in about 1905. They were married about 1900 or so.
Yes.
They were rather pleased when she got married because that cleared off most of their unmarried daughters. She was the 13th child, and he had 6 sons and 7 daughters.
Wow.
And he was left with 2 daughters at that time. All the rest had married or cleared out. And my mother's sister, Monica Eustace, there'd been a bit of trouble about her because she'd very nearly got engaged to a man who had come out with his regiment, who was reputed to be the bastard son of King Edward VII. He wasn't King Edward, he was still the Prince of Wales, of course, then. But my grandfather, who wasn't taking any chances, got his elder sons, who were then high up in the Army and Navy abroad. He got them to make inquiries, and it turned out that the man was an impostor. That is to say, he wasn't a bastard.
He was a genuine legitimate person.
And they were only too pleased when my Aunt Monica met and married her first cousin, Henry Eustace, who'd come out with his regiment.
Jones sounds a Welsh name. Is it a Welsh family?
Well, my father was Welsh. He came from a mining valley. He was the only one that didn't go down the mine and escaped from the valley, as it was put to me by one of his friends. 2 boys escaped. One became a British judge, and the other was my father, who went into the Church of England, having been originally brought up in a nonconformist Welsh valley.
So was he a missionary, or?
No, he wasn't a missionary. He merely served in Wynberg parish, which included a section for Africans who were then in the Cape, because he used to preach to them in Xhosa. He was a good linguist, and it was a pity when they decided later to move back to England.
What date was that when they decided to move back?
Well, first of all, he got a job he moved from Cape Town to a place called Beaufort West, which was a little dorp on the edge of the Karoo, where they were engaged mainly in ostrich farming, not for the eggs but for the feathers, which, as you know, were in a
hot demand
requirement in those days for funerals and other purposes. But my mother couldn't stand the heat there, and so they decided to move back to England.
What date was that?
Oh, about 07, that sort of time, 1907,
so you were
7 or 8.
You were still very, very young.
So I was still very young, but my earliest memories date from Beaufort West rather than Cape Town.
What do you remember of that time?
Well, somebody getting Beaufort West, there were big water channels running down the main street. There was a dam there, and they let out water every so many days, and you channeled it off into your garden by blocking it as it came down. And I remember a great fuss and bother when they were celebrating Mafeking night, and one of the drunks got stuck in the water channel and was nearly drowned.
Yes.
That's about all I can remember of the place. We had a tortoise there, a giant one that I used to ride on. It had to be chained up.
It was a fierce
because
tortoise.
whenever it escaped, it used to go into the vegetable garden and eat all the lettuces and other brassicas. And wasn't very popular.
Yes. I hope we have a photograph of you on your giant tortoise riding at the age of 3.
Unfortunately not, but it still haunts me in my dreams pleasantly from time to time.
So you came back, your parents came back to England. Did you have any brothers and sisters?
No, I was an only child.
Hmm.
And when they came back, we stayed there for a bit, and then my mother showed signs of TB, and so my father decided to move abroad again. And he chose Antofagasta, Chile, because it was a nice dry climate, very suitable for TB people.
Hmm.
Before that, we went to Ireland and stayed on the old family estate of my uncle, where we lived in a remarkably medieval kind of Irish fortress affair, with no sanitation at all.
Do you remember anything about that?
Well, I remember a lot about that because we had, for example, a great deal of importance was attached in those days to bowel actions. And the children were sent out to the lavatories. These had been built in a palatial way as an accessory to the farmyard. And you went into a large chamber with an enormous seat on it with a series of holes of diminishing size. We were fitted onto the appropriate hole.
This was a joint one. I mean, there were
completely communal. We were all taken out after breakfast and dumped on these holes and left to perform in our own ways. And later on, the men, when they cleared out the stables, also came and cleared out these things at a considerable distance down below, because you were on a raise on a great height in this place, and the ground dropped off into the farmyard below. But the grown-ups had a special thunderbox, as they referred to it, which had been ordered from the Army and Navy. One of these little bucket latrine affairs, which was placed in the centre of the lawn for some unknown reason.
So anyone could see you going out to this?
Oh, well, we weren't allowed to go to it, only the grown-ups. So my mother and father and my uncle and aunt were the proud possessors, occupants of this one.
Yes. How long were you in Ireland for?
Only for about 6 months or less, I suppose.
And obviously indelibly impressed
That was the days when there were no motor cars. You went about in jaunting cars.
Jaunting cars?
You know what a jaunting car is?
No.
Well, it's drawn by one horse and it's a box, and you have seats. You sit back to back on these seats facing outwards.
Hmm.
And the driver sits in the front above the horse, and then behind him on each side, two or three people sit in a seat, and there's a well in the middle in which people, or you can dump your property.
I see. No, I haven't.
It's a kind of cart that you don't see anymore now.
This must have been during the First World War you were... Or had it not
this
started?
was before the First
Just before.
World War.
Mm.
Because I went out to Chile for a long time before that and came back in 15.
So you went out to Chile in about 1911-12.
About 1911-12 to Antofagasta, which was a marvellous place.
Hmm. In what way was it marvellous?
Well, it was a complete desert, but beautifully cool at night, because you had a mist that came in from the sea. Mm. And you couldn't grow anything there because the soil was so full of nitrate. And then in the hinterland behind the coastal mountains, you had more or less solid nitrate, which people dug up and put into a train and railed down to Antofagasta, the port, and then lighted it out to windjammers that carried it round the Horn back to Europe. They were just building the Panama Canal at the time, but these sailing ships went right round the Horn and did it that way.
Were there many British or English people there that your father had a curacy or?
Yes, my father was, believe it or not, a canon of the Diocese of the Falkland Islands.
Oh.
He never set foot on the place, but the Falkland Islands was the only British possession in South America, and the Bishop of the Falkland Islands had his base there, but spent all his time on liners which careered round the east and the west coast of South America.
a relatively
You don't know who the bishop was. It wasn't the famous Bishop Sterling, who was the bishop at one time.
No, I was too young to remember any names of bishops and so on, but Sterling certainly I don't think was there then.
He was a relative of mine.
Oh, he was a relative of yours?
On my mother's side, yes. So, what schooling did you have?
Well, my father undertook my schooling and that of a few other English kids there who were destined for English public schools, preparing us for the sort of entrance examination.
And so he prepared you for that?
He prepared me for that, and prepared me too well. Because when I got to my public school, they were still using the old system of Latin pronunciation, whereas my father taught me the new system. And then they changed midway when I was in the school, so I got completely confused. And it can be very awkward when you're being tested in Latin orally. And you're asked what various things which can mean completely different words. Qui, quae, quod is pronounced one way. Quae, qui, quod is pronounced the same word in the other pronunciation. So I got completely tied up in my Latin.
What school did you go on to?
I went to St John's, Leatherhead, and we sailed from South America for England in 1915. And I had my first experience of blackouts and U-boats and things of that sort.
Yes. It was a dangerous trip across.
Oh, very dangerous, because we had no escort. We had to just make it. And we had a complete blackout on the ship.
Why had your parents decided to come back in the middle of the war?
Well, to get me to school. And they didn't. This had been planned at a certain date, and then the war happened. And by the time they could get a boat to take us back, a year had elapsed. And I was about 11 and a half, because St John's, Leatherhead, where I went to school, accepted people rather younger than some of the other schools.
Was your parents' idea to leave you there or to stay in England with you?
No, their idea was to leave me there and go back and visit me later as the opportunity offered. But I never saw them again for about 5 years.
No, because they did go back and they couldn't. Who did you spend your holidays with?
Well, I had a guardian who was my father's original vicar in South Africa, who had retired and become, or at least he left South Africa, and become the parson, I think they called it, or that is to say the manager of the Royal Liverpool Seamen's Orphanage in Newsham Park. And I stayed with him in Liverpool during the war. And until my parents came back and settled in England. And by that time I went out to West Africa.
What sort of man was he? Did you like him?
Oh yes, he was an interesting type. And he had an interesting job, of course. Looking after the orphans of Anglicans and Protestants were incarcerated in the orphanage. Roman Catholics were allowed to stay out because the Catholics objected, and he had the job of visiting their mothers and giving them grants and seeing that the kids were properly brought up in the Liverpool Irish Quarter.
So he was dealing professionally with orphans. Did you yourself feel somewhat of an orphan, having been left by your parents, or not?
Well, it was certainly a traumatic experience going to school for the first time. An only child and thoroughly spoiled. And I went there I arrived the second week of term, because I'd had to have my tonsils taken out in a hospital before I went to school, and that set me back. So that I was the only new boy at the time. But I solved that by going sick and going into the infirmary. And when I went back the next term, I was more or less on a level and had no further trouble.
You say you solved it. It sounds as if you decided to go sick and instructed your body to behave accordingly.
Well, I don't know, but I suppose it was psychosomatic, but anyhow it worked. I didn't do it, I used to do it later to avoid getting beaten. You could try and be sick and you went to the infirmary. And if you handled it properly, you could wangle the thermometer when the nurse was turned by putting it on the radiator beside you. if you put it on too long,
It
you had an absurd temperature. She spotted it.
Yes. Was it one of these schools where you had to be good at games in order to be popular and so on, or not?
Well, I got my popularity in another way. I got in. It's merely a matter of luck whether what sort of reputation you pick up, and I had a reputation of being undisciplined, and prefects were allowed to beat in those cases for minor offences, and so I was always being beaten. And that made me popular in an obscure kind of way.
It was worth it for the popularity to be beaten quite frequently. What sort of offences were? I can't imagine you were them.
Well,
untidiness, being late.
Well, untidiness, being late, being scruffy, breaking some minor rule that I've forgotten completely now.
Yes. What the trauma of I went through the same thing. My parents left me and went back to Assam and left me at a public school, and I remember being extremely lonely and missing them terribly, deeply. Did you have these? Were you close to your parents and missed them?
Well, I was close to my parents, but I don't think I was particularly lonely, and once I got adjusted to the school, that is in my second term, I had my friends, and we had a very happy time together.
So you enjoyed it?
I enjoyed it. It was very rigorous because it was in the height of World War I, and rationing was in its infancy. And we were rationed to a pound of sugar a week. And whenever there was a riot in the East End, they took away our meat ration and sent it there, and those who had to cater for us had to do the best they could to feed us. But of course, we were fortunate in having what was then referred to as a communal kitchen, World War II British restaurant, where they were able to feed you on imported milks, foods, and cheeses and things like that, which came from Holland and Denmark, which were not incorporated in the German organisation. So if you had any money, you could rush out in a break before lunch, fill yourself up with macaroni cheese, then come back to school, eat the school dinner for what it was worth, then dash out within half an hour of dinner and play a game of rugby football or something like that.
Yes.
And survive fairly well.
Survival of the richest, as usual. What were you particularly interested in at school? Were there any disciplines or hobbies that you...
Well, I had a good voice, and I got into the choir, and that gave me a certain amount of satisfaction. But then the choir master, who was from King's here, was called up, and an old Duddery master took on the choir after that. And there was very little interest given to it after that, until this master, surprisingly enough, came back alive from the war after it and resuscitated it. But by that time my voice had broken.
And it wasn't as good a voice after it had broken?
Well, after it had broken, I didn't develop any decent voice. I became a so-called alto or countertenor, and then gravitated to bass. But it was a good choir. It sang in Westminster Abbey and various places like that.
Have you?
And he was a damn good choir master.
Have you retained your interest in music?
No, when I went up to Oxford, I was fed up with choirs, and I kept away from all music, I regret to say. Except, I think, Gershwin, because at that time, Rhapsody in Blue was being played in every college quadrangle. You couldn't get away from it.
So what about subjects? What you were beginning to specialise for university? What?
Well, I was again very lucky there, because the only subject they taught well at St John's was classics. We were the sons of it was a school founded for the sons of the poorer clergy, that was its full title.
Oh, I see.
The wealthier ones no doubt went to Lancing. And We got them from all over the place. Came in with weird accents from the north of Scotland and the darkest quarters of Wales and so on, but we turned them out with an impeccable Oxford accent. And to get them into Oxford or Cambridge, we had to teach them something, and they taught them classics. Very well. Well, I found that I couldn't compete with other people in classics, so I decided I would offer history. And some unfortunate master was forced to teach me some history. And they had to mark this. And of course, the classicists cancelled each other out. And my marks, nobody could compare me with anybody. And I ended up as top of the school in marks in my last year. And my name now is emblazoned
on the walls,
in conspicuous prominence in this particular area.
You enjoyed history though, as a subject?
No, I didn't particularly, but it was a subject. And when I went up to Oxford to apply, I put in for a Welsh scholarship at Jesus on the strength of my Welsh ancestry. And I suppose I got in on the strength of my essay, which dealt with classical matters. But anyhow, when I showed it to the master when I got back at school, he said, well, hang on to it, whatever you do, you won't get anything else anywhere.
Encouraging.
So I decided not to apply for Cambridge, but stuck to Jesus Oxford.
So when did you go up to Oxford? What year was this?
Well, I went up in 23.
Your parents had now come back?
My parents came back, no, they came back in 24, 25, that sort of time.
So
but I was still with the Guardian.
And
by that time, yes, they came back, and my father had to begin all over again. And he went into the Church of Wales this time and was a curate at Colwyn Bay until he got a living in a place called Eglis Bar.
And they stayed in England from...
And they remained from England after that.
Yes. How did you find Oxford just after the... Well, it was a bit after the war, wasn't it? It was 5 years after the war. Did you enjoy...
Well, I enjoyed Oxford because by then I'd grown sufficiently strong to be able to play games, and I was involved in the college rugger and so on. It was a place that divided itself very much into Hearties and aesthetes. I was neither. Harold Acton was one of the principal aesthetes. I don't remember the Hearties. And I soon got playing for the London Welsh.
Did you?
Because in those days, most of the London clubs relied for most of their players on Oxford and Cambridge. And there was a general exodus on Saturday. People from both universities, if they couldn't get into the two university teams, they found their way up to London and played for the various London ones. And I went up to the London Welsh.
And you played for the London Welsh. That's quite a distinction.
Played for the London Welsh. We had a Jones 3/4 line. It was very convenient having the name Jones, because you could be sure they'd get your initials wrong, and even if they didn't, you could bluff it out, because the president of Jesus objected very much to his young men wasting their time out of Oxford, and you could only get a couple of exeats a term to go to London. Well, one just ignored that and went. And he and his wife, because he was partially blind, used to read the papers. The sporting side of some of the London papers then used to publish the full teams of the London clubs, and he would see which of his young men were playing. Well, he never recognised me.
Your initials were always wrong.
I was always a Jones, and he gave up Jones.
What position did you play?
3/4. As I say, we had a Jones 3/4 line.
Which one? Centre or
wing usually, because I was fast.
And then you, at that time, Oxford, presumably the history tripos was 3 years, and with all the examinations at the end of the 3 years.
Yes, well, I wanted to go abroad again, and I thought I hadn't heard of the colonial service but I knew about the consular, so I wanted to switch to languages. But my college wouldn't let me. Quite rightly, they said, you can't possibly. We are a college where we only allow our students to read for honours. In those days, in the university, but either read for honours or for a past degree. And a lot of people in other colleges were reading in past degrees, but Jesus insisted on efficiency and scholarship.
And you couldn't do an honours in modern
Well, I
languages?
couldn't have done an honours in French and German or any language because I hadn't got any language, and I'm very bad at languages anyway. So after taking past moderations, which the first exam was called, I had to switch to history.
I see. Who were your teachers? Do you remember?
Well, my only famous one was a man called Gronwy Edwards, who eventually ended up at the Record
Public
Office.
Record Office, you see.
And I owe a great deal to him because we had one pair. I took early history rather than modern history because there were fewer books to read. And he covered one paper called Stubbs' Charters, and a man called Stubbs wrote a book and produced a whole lot of charters. Well, I never read the book from cover to cover, but we attended his lectures, and his lectures were so organised.
This is Gronwy Edwards, is
This was Gronwy Edwards.
Not Stubbs's. Yes.
Not Stubbs, no, Stubbs is dead a long time ago. But Gronwy Edwards' lectures were such that he covered every question those who sat in the exams could possibly think up. It's rather difficult thinking about original questions on Stubbs' charters, and Gronwy had them covered. So you went to his lectures and you copied them down straight off. And you could guarantee that the examiners would have thought up one or two new questions, but you'd have a whole lot of questions you could get through. Well, there was no problem in that paper. I got an alpha in that paper without any difficulty, without any work, apart from copying it down and memorising it. But I passed in history. And then I found that you could get into the colonial service. I would have liked to have gone to the Sudan because the leave was better and the pay was better. But the Sudan was so popular that only blues and people with great ability could get into it. As you know the old story, the Sudan was where the blues ruled the blacks.
Blues being the
Oxford and Cambridge blues. I never achieved a blue either. I wasn't good enough or large enough for that.
What had made you decide you wanted to go into the colonial service or the...
Well, because I couldn't, as I thought, get into the consular service. And it did take you abroad and it seemed attractive. And I put in for the West African section because again the pay was better and the leave was better.
What sort of pay and what sort of leave do you remember?
I don't remember the pay, but it was very small by modern standards. And the leave was worked out at every 18 months.
Sort of 3 months back in...
Well, it meant that by the time you got back to England, it took you 14 days by boat and 14 days back again to Nigeria, so it was about a month. So it worked out roughly, and 4.5 months leave. So it worked out at 18 months, then half a year, and then back again.
Did West Africa still have the reputation for being climatically and health-wise very dangerous?
Well, I didn't realise at the time that there was no cure for for yellow fever. They invented one while I was out there, but I didn't know about that. But I didn't think about disease in those days. I had been in Africa before, and I didn't mind getting back there.
Do you remember the interview you had for the? Presumably they interviewed you to see whether you were an appropriate person.
No, I don't remember much about the interview. All I remember was I was looking for various jobs abroad, and I also put in at the same time for a job in the Bombay Burma Teak Company. And I went to that interview before I went for the Colonial Office interview. And I sort of tossed up as to which I'd take. Well,
you were offered both, were you?
I was offered both, yes. But I bought a pair of gloves for the Bombay teak interview. And I left them in the taxi afterwards. And so having lost the gloves, I thought that was a bad omen, and I planked from West Africa.
On a pair of gloves, your whole future life hinged.
When it sounded very attractive, the Bombay-Burma thing. You disappeared into the teak forest with elephants in the right time of the year, and then you emerged the wrong time and spent the rest of the time drinking in the clubs or wherever it was where you organised the sending of teak to this country.
Yes, it sounds very like George Orwell, sort of Burmese days world. When you got to West Africa, what were you assigned to do?
When I went to West Africa, I went straight into the administrative service, and I became an acting ADO. That is to say, I was an ADO in all but in official name and in salary.
ADO is an assistant district officer.
In the old days, they used to be commissioners. Then they decided to call us officers instead.
Yes.
But the locals always referred to as DC.
And where did you go first?
Well, I was posted to a place called Penny.
This was in Nigeria.
This was in eastern Nigeria. You arrived in Lagos, and it was they'd suddenly managed to recruit in a big way from Nigeria and the Gold Coast, and the boat that took us out had about 150 or more cadets on it, and we had a splendid time amongst ourselves, and everybody else avoided us like the plague. And we were a slightly different breed to the older coasters and administrators, because previously they'd recruited mainly from the army. Now Sir Rafe Furs at the Colonial Office had persuaded them that it was better to have people who were varsity trained, and we were mainly university undergraduates, plus one or two ex-army people who had managed to get in, or people from World War I, you see, who were looking for a job.
Was there resentment among the old army people about this new university-trained group coming in, or not?
No, the resentment that I found when I went out there amongst my colleagues was against those who had been recruited in 1914-15 and were in a higher position to the young men who had been enlisted in the army and then come out to Nigeria and been taken on then, who found themselves in inferior positions to these people who were put in a category called 1915ers. And you found, or at least I found when I went out there, that my residents in the eastern region were 1915ers. My dears were people who'd been in World War I and were captains and commanders and so on, and were very resentful of the people immediately above them.
I see. Had you had any language training or any sort of training before you arrived there, or did you do
well, I went on a colonial services course, and I was told on this course that I should read about, I was going to be posted to eastern Nigeria, and I should read about the Ibibio and learn the Ibibio, read about the Igbo and learn the Ibibio language.
Yes, you used the word Ibibio. What is?
Well, there were two tribes, totally different, speaking totally different languages, of course. And I was posted not to an Igbo division, but to an Ibibio division. And eventually I passed an Ibibio language exam. I passed it primarily because the man that took the exam was in the Scottish mission there, with a very strong Scottish accent, a man called MacGregor. And that just came right through in the dictation. So although Ibibio is a tonal language, I could get it absolutely perfectly with a Scotch accent. I never spoke the language again, and after that I was always posted to Igbo divisions.
Total waste of time.
But nobody bothered about native languages in southern Nigeria because there were so many about the place, and the lingua franca was English. The better class spoke proper English or Barbaro English, and the marketplace you spoke Pidgin English, which is a lovely, colourful language.
What books were you, was it suggested that you read at that time? Who were the authorities on?
Oh, they didn't say. They said read books about the Igbo. Well, there weren't any books about the Igbo, at least. Oh yes, there were Talbot, but they weren't called. They weren't actually about many Igbo, and as far as I can make out, Talbot's interpreters, even when he was in an Igbo area, were Ijaw people. However,
so did you read them? This was Amori.
Oh no, I didn't bother to read them because the Colonial Services exam tried to cram you with about 5 or more different key subjects in the space of about a couple of terms. Law, colonial history, tropical medicine, tropical agriculture. I've forgotten the other ones, but we were supposed to master all these, and we merely attended a course of lectures and then sat an exam. And none of the things that one got on the course did one follow up very much. But what it had the effect of doing was to familiarise you with what some of these experts who came out later thought they were doing in the agricultural or engineering or legal line.
What sort of role did people think you were to play in West Africa? Was it the idea that the white man's burden, that you were to maintain the status quo and to administer justice and so on, or?
Well, we were never lectured on what our role should be. The people who did this were the Belgians and the French. They believed very much in telling you how you ought to behave. But they couldn't very well tell us what our role should be because we were on a colonial services course going out to anywhere, from the Gilbert and Ellis down to the Caribbean or anyone else, you see. So they couldn't tell us exactly what you'd meet when you got out in the colony.
Had to be very general.
And you were expected to find out when you got there.
What did you find out when you got there? What did you think your role was when you...
Well, a very pleasant role really, of trying to reconcile the friction between the people in your division and the government higher up. You would get an order from the government telling you to do something, and it either could be done or it couldn't be done. It was up to you to try and find out and put it over to the people under you. You were also responsible for keeping order in your division, and one got the impression that people were very grateful to you for doing so in the eastern region, because there previously there had been no overall authority, and when we came in, every little village was in a state of armed neutrality or more active hostility with its neighbour. And from the 19th century onwards, the British consul had been intervening in the disputes between the people in the coastal states, trying to settle the differences and then drawing a treaty about it.
What sort of orders did you receive from above you and had to try and carry out at the local level?
Well, what the way it worked was that somebody would raise a question, shall we say, in the Houses of Parliament, wanting to know about somebody being flogged, should we say. Well, a very emotive term. And you would then find yourself faced with a return for the Nigerian Blue Book, which listed the amount of cases of flogging in each colonial territory. And you were asked in your division to send a return of flogging. Well, you just either invented figures or you said that nobody is flogged in this division. And if you used the word flogging in the local dialect, you'd find that flogging merely meant hitting. In a case, for instance, a man would say, "He flogged me." How did he flog you? He flogged me for eye. In other words, he hit him in the eye. On the other hand, if you went up to northern Nigeria, you got flogging was part of the initiation of Fulani boys and so on. And in the prisons, of course, you were flogged with a British cat and nine-tail. It was a punishment there.
But it didn't happen very much in the area.
Well, we had no flogging. But the reactions to flogging were very different. In northern Nigeria, they took it for granted and didn't think anything of it in the prisons and so on. In the eastern region, the idea of a person being beaten like that horrified them and shocked them completely because they'd never experienced anything like it. And our various returns used to be merely a matter of concocted by the district officers. You just put a few figures in.
What was your you said one of your main roles was as a kind of justice of the peace, magistrate. What kind of cases did you have to adjudicate on?
Well, the colonial judicial system was very complicated because you had, first of all, the Supreme Court of Nigeria, where only judges, specialized judges, featured. You had the ordinary provincial courts, which was still under the judicial department, where you had judges and magistrates. Then you had the so-called native courts, and where the local people tried their own cases and administered native law and custom, except where it conflicted with British ideas of justice and equity or some term like that, which meant that you couldn't try a witchcraft case. In a native court, you merely called it using bad medicine, or you got round it in that way.
So you had these two levels, and in which level were you involved?
Well, you were involved in you were magistrate. You were gazetted as a magistrate in the provincial court. As such, you could try cases in the ordinary Nigerian courts, which admitted barristers, lawyers to plead. And you also could review or hear on appeal cases that were heard in the native court. Anybody tried in the native court and sentenced to imprisonment would have to, his case had to be reviewed by an administrative officer before he could be admitted to the prison. So what you found yourself landed with was a whole lot of court messengers bringing in a whole lot of prisoners with the judgment books, which were written by the court clerks in English, because it's the only language they knew how to write anyway. And you read through the case, and if it looked okay, you let the man go into prison.
And if you didn't look okay?
If you didn't look okay, well then you sent it back to the court and said, "I will review, let this man go back on bail." Or if it was a serious case, you had him detained in the prison and you went out and reviewed the case.
And in that case, would you have the hearing on your own? He would just come and you would question him? Or would you do it in a court setting?
Well, if I would do it in a court setting. And in some of the divisions in the eastern region, native courts were so popular because they were very cheap and lawyers could not appear in them. that you heard about 40 or more cases a day, and you'd be spending about 2 or 3 weeks hearing them.
What about the noise? It's bedlam. It's absolute bedlam.
We've got to ask you about the noise that went on in the court, Gwilym.
Oh.
I mean, our vision of a court is, silence and one person speaking at a time.
Yeah, it was a very interesting proceedings, really. You'd go to the court, and when you reviewed a case, you'd have the people before you, you'd ask them questions, and you'd ask the bench questions about it. And the court, there'd be a large audience, because it was the only sort of amusement, local amusement going, and there'd be dead silence. As soon as you'd heard the evidence and given your judgment, you said, I set this aside, or I altered it to so and so and so and so, and you pronounced that, everybody started talking at once, discussing it. And while you carefully wrote down in the book, as briefly as you could, your confirmation or your alteration of the sentence.
So it was like the end of a football game or something.
And you could get the feel of whether you were right or wrong in your decision, from the noise in the court.
Was a lot of noise a good sign or a bad sign?
Well, it depended on the kind of noise. Some noises were noises of approbation, yes. They were watching to see whether this would happen, because what you were looking out for was where the judges had been got at, and they'd given what was a judgment that was quite contrary to the facts.
How was it possible to adjudicate in these kind of very intricate cases without a detailed knowledge of the social structure, customs, culture of the people?
Well, where you didn't know about it, you could ask questions. And the great thing about Igbos and Ibibios compared to Northerners was that they were quite ready to say and to answer back. Northerners, particularly in the Hausa country, were scared stiff of what they would say, because the news would get back to the emir or some of their chiefs as to what they were saying, and they'd get it in the neck if they hadn't said the right thing. But there, when in a meeting, for instance, you could get at the facts very easily, because one side would make their statement and the other side would immediately rush in and say, that's a bloody lie. It's like this. And you play them off against each other and get at the truth that way.
Do you remember any particular case or cases which particularly either intrigued you or worried you? Were there any that you still remember?
I remember quite a lot of amusing cases. I remember one case, I can give you a copy of it. I took a copy of it. I didn't hear this case, but I was waiting and looking through an old judgment book, and I found that the court, while they were waiting for people to turn up, had decided to guy a native court case, and they prosecuted a number of frogs for creating disturbance in the native court compound. And they got court messengers to give certain evidence which was recorded against the frogs, and you got somebody else speaking on behalf of the frogs and giving their case, and you got the judgment, and it was a complete replica of a typical native court case.
Were the frogs found guilty or not?
The frogs were found, no, they were found it was their custom to make a noise when it rained. And therefore,
it was the act of a reasonable frog.
It was a perfectly good judicial decision was given on this. They were not breaking the law, because it was only reasonable for frogs to make a noise when it rained.
That's nice.
But I remember another case. The charge went £5 damages for deformation of character by saying that plaintiff played at harlots with mission teachers for cups of tea. Which meant that a young woman was made her fiancé take an action out on her behalf because her friends were saying that she was flirting with mission teachers.
Very nice.
Or another one, £5 damages for taking so-and-so to such and such a town and where with view to marriage, and then not marrying her, wasting plaintiff's time.
Yes, breach of promise of a kind, yes.
But the great thing about being a district officer in my day was that there were no telephones, which meant that you were on the spot and you had to make a decision. And if anybody sent anything through to you, it had to come by telegram, and people think twice, even in the bureaucracy, before they send a telegram. And you'd get a telegram, and all you need to do to that would be to send another telegram back. Your so-and-so received, usual action taken. Well, the chances were that the recipient was not prepared to admit that he didn't know what the usual action was and would leave it at that. If, on the other hand, he didn't, then he'd say, please wire what action taken. You could then have time to write a memorandum explaining why you couldn't do anything.
Or you could say the telegram.
Or you could hurry up and do something and send it back.
So you were really very much on your own.
You were on your own as a district officer. You had to make the decision, and it didn't really matter what decision you made, provided you made one. And it was a relatively sensible one. And in a land case, for instance, there wasn't any accurate judicial decision because nobody knew where the boundaries were. All you had to do was to say, this is the boundary. And then at least they had something to go on.
And they accepted it. I mean, when you said this is the boundary, then people would say...
Well, they would accept it for the time being, and depending on other causes usually, they might reactivate it. Young men, for instance, from one side might be taunting young men at the other side, saying you lost the case. And then they probably go and try and raise some more money and fight the case again, or raise it again. The trouble with land cases was, if they got from the native court into the protectorate court, lawyers came in, and then they went on appealing these cases higher and higher until they got right up to the West African Court of Appeal. And the people raised the money to pay the lawyers and beggar themselves.
Were people beginning already to use law as a threat against their adversaries, threatening to take them to law and thereby to impoverish them, or not? This happened in many parts of the world.
Don't be mistaken. Africans, or at least the Africans I dealt with, are very much better acquainted with the niceties of law and what you can do and not do to right your wrongs than most Englishmen or Europeans. They have to be on the guard to know what they can do and how they can, what are their remedies for righting wrongs. And they appreciated judicial decisions. The noise in the court that you got, if you gave the right decision, would instance that.
Because Edmund Leach, describing law in Sri Lanka, for example, he described it in a phrase. He said it was the favourite village sport. And your account of the sort of roar that came up at the end of the game, so to speak, it was the appreciation of an art form.
It was, absolutely.
And you found the same thing.
Because you have a number of different ways in an Igbo village, shall we say, rather than African, of righting your wrongs, depending what the wrong is. You can either settle the matter at home by going to an elder and asking him to settle the case for you. It'll cost you some money, but it won't cost you very much. And if your opponent is prepared to do the same, well, you can settle it in this way. I don't call it arbitration because they didn't. It was considered settling a case. If he won't do that, you can then take out action in the native court. And in that case, you can get to accept or not the judgment of the native court. If you don't accept the judgment, you can then write a petition to the district officer asking him to review the case. If you don't like the district officer's review, you're at liberty, if you want to write to the resident above him and ask him to review the case. And if you don't like the resident's decision, you can go right up and ask the governor to intervene and so on. You don't get many going as far as the governor, but you've got quite a number of residents' appeals up to the resident or reviews up to the resident.
As you know, there's been a famous discussion or argument in the study of African legal systems between two schools. The school of Max Gluckman, which argued that the basis of legal process in African, particularly in Central African courts, was very similar to that in Western societies. It just looks rather different on the surface. It was based on the same ideas of the reasonable man and so on. And the other view of Paul Bohannon and others that TIV justice anyway was very, very dissimilar. The whole, because it was embedded within their society, it was very difficult to translate out of their concept into our own, and therefore each legal system is very different. Did you, from your experience, did you come down on one side or other in that debate?
Well, I think that I would say it's more a matter of two people going to two extremes. Rarely the two go together. But in the Barotse situation, you've got people who are expected to know about the law and to judge cases and so on. Whereas amongst the TIV, it's much more a matter of consensus and a lot of people talking together and then deciding what to do. And therefore, the judgment is likely to be a bit more fluid and depend less on particular cases, previous cases. And it's not going to be a matter of case law, it's going to be a matter of what are we going to do at the moment to settle this thing. I think it's more like that.
So what they were looking at was really rather different in the...
They were looking at two different societies.
And different levels of institutionalization.
The last thing that the TIV can tolerate is anybody in authority over him. And they like to get together and talk about things. And as you know, anybody who has any authority in the TIV is a witch. They're good witches, bad witches, but you've got to tolerate them.
Did you come across, turning to witchcraft, did you come across witchcraft beliefs at all in your...
Oh, any number of them, but you've got a big difference between Igbo and most other people, Cross River, Yoruba and other people. Igbos know all about witchcraft, but they say they don't suffer from it. In other words, they stick together more closely and they're much less likely to be paranoid about their relatives persecuting them and so on.
So you weren't asked to adjudicate in witchcraft cases? You weren't allowed officially anyway, but in some disguised form it didn't come up?
Well, what you were involved in was to accuse a person of being a witch was a criminal offence under the Nigerian code, because it was a form of political warfare in Calabar and places like that. If you accused a person of being a witch, he had to take poison to prove he wasn't, and if he vomited it in time, he was proved right.
Poison oracle.
And we got a whole lot of cases in my early days of anti-witch movements which worked like that. There was a case in Calabar, for instance, where two young men were filled with the Holy Ghost from a Christian mission, and they were maintained by a local chief, and they were hired out by him to go out smelling out witches in various villages, and then they would be brought in, and the witnesses would say how they had been identified by these people as a witch. They had taken the poison. They had recovered.
What was your role in that?
Well, my role in that would be prosecuting the chief and the young men, but in particular the chief who was employing them, for breaking the Nigerian criminal law.
Mm.
But there were other witchcraft cases, movements in which, as they carefully pointed out to, it didn't break the law. They didn't. You got special medicines which you brought to the town.
Mm.
All the people came and swore and drank the medicine. It was then shoved up in a stick, and various lines were taken from it, so that you had to walk under an archway and be infected by it. But if you were a witch and went out at night time, this anti-witchcraft medicine called Infam would catch you, and you would die. Your head would be taken back, and you'd run at the nose, and you gradually, unless you could find and sacrifice a white sheep in time, you would be killed by this medicine. Well, when we went into this, it coincided very nicely with an outbreak of cerebrospinal meningitis, which was being spread round this area by a village that had just got this medicine and was passing it on to different villages. I spoke to a particular, I was waiting at a meeting, and I asked them, I said, have you got, I gather you've got this medicine called Infam, because I'd seen it as I came in. He said, oh yes. I said, does it work? Oh, he said, yes, very well. I said, well, how many witches has it killed? And he said, oh, 7. And then I said, how does it work? And then he told me the full details that I've told you here. When I got back to the station, I checked in with the medical statistics and so on, and I found that 9 people had died of cerebrospinal meningitis in this particular village.
So 2 different causes
2
have been
different
given
interpretations.
for the same symptoms. That's very nice.
But you could have an awful trouble with imitative people with witchcraft.
Mm. Yes, Laura Bohannon describes some of that, doesn't she?
Yes. Well, there was a man called McBride that had told me a particular case where a young man comes back from work and finds his brothers died. He's been told that he's been killed by the witchcraft of the witches in this area. And he complains to the police, and the police round up a number of people who he accuses, and they confess to having done it. The old man says, yes, I did it, and goes into full details of how they killed this man by poison, then the body was buried, then they came along in a witchcraft cabal and they dug it up and they cut it into pieces and they shared it all out, and he got the so-and-so. And so they said, well, anyhow, before we can go on with this trial, we must have some indication of the body. There must be some bits and pieces left. They sent out a policeman to go and bring it in. Came back with a perfectly intact body. And then the DO turned to this man who just confessed to doing all this, and he said, how do you explain this? He said, well, you don't understand. That was our witchcraft. Well, he said, you're in a nice position when you get that sort of thing. Mm. And as far as the poison is concerned, well, you can't prove that he was killed by poison because A, nobody knows much about the tiered poisons, and B, even if you get bits and pieces of this man to the government analyst at Lagos, by the time they arrive there, they'll be pretty high, and the man will not know what the hell it is anyway.
Mm. Apart from the judicial work, what other main things filled up your days, I mean your working days? Were you involved in the taxation at all, or?
Well, taxation caused a great deal of trouble in my time because they'd never been taxed before, directly taxed, that is. Lugard, in theory, when Nigeria was combined, the two north and southern provinces were combined in 1914, the idea was native administration was to be extended to the eastern provinces. Well, the DOs put in a rearguard action and kept it at bay until I got out. And when they could no longer say that they hadn't got enough staff to do this.
Your arrival tipped the balance.
Well, my arrival and my colleagues' arrivals tipped the balance, and they could no longer say we hadn't got enough people to do it. And they introduced it just at the time when the bottom had fallen out of the palm oil market, and this area lived by exporting palm oil, and it was going down and down and down. It was in the 27, 29. And we were forced to take nominal rolls and then collect tax from these people who'd never paid tax before. Well, the people we made collect the tax were the people who we'd recognised as so-called warrant chiefs. In other words, we gave them a warrant to sit in the native court and try cases. They were sort of JPs, as it were. And these unfortunates had to collect the tax. Well, the next year, there was a rumour went round, circulated no doubt by the men, that women were going to be taxed. And all the women mobilised and rioted, and the whole thing ended up by troops shooting about 36 of them dead in a terrible commotion which attracted a great deal of colonial attention and led to Margaret Green being sent out and writing Igbo women's affairs.
Oh. Did you know Margaret Green?
Oh yes, I was district officer at Kigley, and I found her the particular village where she did her research.
She's given all her papers to the department archive.
I brought them in.
You brought them in, that's right, yes. What sort of person was she? Was she a good anthropologist?
She was a good anthropologist, and the pity of it was that when she went to Mbadja, she became hooked on language. And so she ended up working hard on the Igbo language and gave up more or less any further anthropological study.
I see.
Which was a terrible pity because she, unlike Sylvia Leith Ross, she really did produce a valuable work. The only work that I know of that's been done specifically on African women in such detail.
Yes. What was the basis of the taxation? Was it, you say it was a nominal roll, was it based on land or wealth or just
we were asked to assess the income of the people.
Each person?
Of an average tax-paying male. Completely bogus. The great thing, you decide to do something, then you have to have documents to prove it. And all sorts of assessment reports, they were called, were produced, showing you what the earning, working on what you thought the earning of a particular village was, broken down into particular individuals and so on. And it had no real scientific validity at all. It was just a guess.
Do you think people were lenient, or in your case, it must have been very awkward to have had to do this, knowing that you were pressing on people who were already suffering from a drop in their income, who'd never been taxed before, and so on?
Well, the whole thing was absolutely ridiculous. In northern Nigeria, assessment reports worked because you went to a village and you assessed it, and the village paid a sort of collective tax. And the people in the village had for years paid tax. All that Lugard's government did was to make it a bit more regular and less oppressive. But in the East, nobody had paid tax. And they were paying quite a tax if you consider how much palm oil they exported and the export duties that the government was charging on the palm oil and kernels when they left the country, which were naturally affected in the price that was paid to these people for their palm oil. And of course, it was not an assessment tax on a village, it was an assessment tax on adult, able-bodied males. And young men had no money at all. Old men might have a little money. The
It had to
people
be
who
paid
probably had a lot of money, certainly in the Yoruba side, were the women, because they traded in the market.
It had to be paid in cash, did it?
It was paid in cash.
Was the idea that there's, as you know, various theories as to why these colonial taxes were put on, and one theory is that it was a indirect way of forcing people into the labour market, thereby in order to pay their taxes they would have to work for you, and then you could sell them your products as well. Was there anything in that theory, or was it just that it was felt that the colonial administration was expensive and it should pay its own way?
Well, there never was any kind of pressure to get people into the labour market in Nigeria because the population was too heavy. And the eastern region were looking for jobs everywhere. And there was no problem there at all.
There were plenty of people to do the jobs.
Plenty of people to do the jobs, and unlike northern Nigeria, southern Nigeria, young men were expendable because the farming work was done by men and women and could be done by the elderly men and could be done throughout the year, whereas in northern Nigeria you wanted a labour force to work very fast and in quantity when the rains came. And then they were idle for the rest of the year.
So you had this unpleasant taxation job, you had your judicial work. Were there any other main parts of the day?
Prison.
Well, there were all sorts of things. You were helping the people plan and develop their country, planning roads and so on, putting up buildings and trying to suggest introduce different crops or different variations of land holding and things like that sort of thing.
And as related to your judicial work, you had some work in relation to the prisons, did you?
Well, in the station itself, somebody was in charge of the prisons. You were usually the junior ADO. Somebody was in charge of the local treasury, because there was always government money that had to be paid out, government money which had to be received. One of the things that's not mentioned in the old days of colonial administration is the cost of transport. Your loads had to be carried and on people's heads, and you needed about 20 people when you travelled, and you travelled all the time, if you had any sense, because you were moving around in your division seeing what was happening. And that was a very expensive idea. As soon as you got cars in, you needed roads, and so you had to plan roads and talk with the people where they wanted the roads to go and so on. They would say, we want a road to our town. You'd go out and show them or talk with them about a suitable route to take, avoiding streams and rivers, because they would think in terms of a road. You'd go straight there if you're walking. You'd say, no, you've got to go around here, explain why.
When you were walking, as you seem to have been a lot of the time, were you keeping these tour diaries that were kept in other official tour diaries to say where you'd been and what you'd noticed?
Well, these were things that were introduced in the very early days, before my time, and nobody ever bothered to keep them up, because you were doing far too many other things. You may have been walking. Later on, of course, you were going by car, and anyhow, in early days you went on a bicycle. Your office followed you, and you always had a vast amount of paperwork that you had to deal with as well. I had tables made in my rest houses, 6 foot square, about this size, any bigger. And my boy would put my breakfast here and I'd come and eat it. A court messenger would come in from the office and put my office files there, and I'd move from my breakfast to my office files. And then if I had a bath, they'd put my clothes on another corner of the table,
So you,
and so on.
you revolved around this
You
table.
revolve around the table like a man has his teapot.
And you had a standard table in each.
Standard sized table.
What else did you take with you on your tour?
Well, you normally took with you a camp table, camp chair, camp bed, a bath, a tin bath. You had...
was this the famous tin bath that was also used for getting across rivers or some...
Oh, you could if you didn't want to wade or swim. You could sit in your tin bath. The bath, you see, had a wicker basket inside it, which contained your clothes, so it contained all your clothes. And you take that out and sit in it, and people would ferry it across. If the river, that would only a river that was shallow enough for people to walk and steady the bath. You wouldn't risk it in a deep river. But it was one way of crossing rivers if you didn't want to get your feet wet.
So you would process with about 10 or 15 porters?
No, 20.
20. With all this paper and tent.
Well, in Calabar, where I used to do this, through the forests of Oban, near this Quarop Reserve, you'd be woken at daybreak, as soon as it got light, with an orange and a cup of tea or something of that sort. You would get up and walk, and after around about 9 o'clock you'd catch up with your breakfast, which had gone ahead and preceded you. While you were having your breakfast, your bed and the rest of your camp equipment went on. And when you'd finished your breakfast, you got up and continued walking. And by about 2 or so, you got to your final destination. And there was lunch waiting for you. Or if it's a longer walk, you might have a snack lunch on the way and arrive at about 4 or 5 and find a hot bath waiting for you. They'd boil the water in a couple of kerosene tins and put it into your beautiful hot bath, and there it was waiting for you.
What were you eating on these tours? I mean, did you take a lot of food with you, or did you eat whatever happened to be available in the area?
Both. You had various tin things. You had splendid outfitting firms called Colonial Outfitters. Mine was called Griffiths McAllister. And you went into this place just before you went back from your leave.
In London?
In London. And you'd say, bring me the invoice you gave me for last year. You'd go through the invoice and say, well, I don't want that, I think I'll have that. And they'd suggest things, and in about half an hour you'd have planned the amount of tinned food you'd be sent out with you for that tour for 18 months. And it had been made up into boxes of the right kind. So many boxes, 1 box of flour, 1 of tins of tinned fruit, salmon, various other tins and so on. And that would form your basic store. And then you'd live on local meat and local vegetables wherever you could get them. Yams rather than potatoes, and a thing called okra you've probably heard of. And any fruit you could get. Bananas, of course, and oranges.
What about drink? Did you take large stocks of...
Well, you could buy that locally. So you didn't bother to take those out with you, because anyhow you couldn't take enough drink for a tour, it would ruin you. Though whiskey, I may say, only cost 5 bob when I went out there first. But it went up to about 10 to 15 bob while I was out there. But whiskey was your cheapest drink.
Really?
Beer, you see, in those days had to be sent out in bottles and naturally cost a lot.
Didn't whiskey...
It was only with independence and after World War II that they started building local breweries. The Belgians got onto it first, and they supplied us during the war with beer from the Belgian Congo. And we found this extremely gave us a great deal of headaches and so on, and we protested about this, and then they went into it and said, oh, they were sorry. They supplied us with the wrong quality of beer. This was the kind they supplied their local natives.
That's nice. When you were travelling through all these villages, were you struck by the beauty? I mean, I've never been in that part of the world. Was it very beautiful as you toured through the landscape? Or?
Well, not in my part. Nigeria varies. Where you've got mountains and things like that, it can be beautiful, but where you've got tropical rainforest, you don't see anything.
And this was tropical rainforest?
And this was tropical rainforest, or in the most of the surrounding country, secondary forest growth. So that you'd have vegetation about the height of this room or so. And then as soon as it gets to this height or a little lower, men would go in underneath with cutlasses and slash it down and burn it and then farm it.
Yes, so it was a slash and burn.
Slash and burn, but rotational.
Yes. On a 7-year rotation? Or?
Very depending on the soil and depending on the density of population. So for every 4th year in most places that I knew of, where it was dense, and then it would go up higher. There's an optimum period in each case, and they've worked it out over centuries. Don't go away with the idea that they're simple, brainless agriculturalists. They know their system, and all you've got to do is to help them improve it by suggesting things that they now can afford to buy, like fertilizers.
Yes, well, I found that in the Himalayas too. They know it much better than we could ever.
They know it very much better, and it differs in each area.
It's very
and the experts who come out and advise these modern independent governments don't know a damn thing locally, because they never go out of their headquarter stations or their agricultural headquarter stations.
Yes, I've seen that. They were cultivating with hoes, were they, or on the hoe?
Hoes, and you get to do 2 varieties of hoes. In the savannah country, they use long-handled hoes and get the leverage there. In the forest country, it's eastern Nigeria anyway. It's soft soil, sandy, and they use short-handled hoes.
And was the work mainly done by women, or?
It varies. The Yoruba men, Hausa, northern Nigeria mainly men, eastern Nigeria men and women. The men cut, slash and burn. The combined family raise the yam hills. The men plant yams, the women plant cover crops on this area. The men train the yam vines, the women weed, and then the men dig up the yams, the women plant additional crops, and the men store their yams, and the women store their crops, and each own their own particular crops.
Did you see any of their, the other side of their life, their ritual and religious activities at all?
You could if you wanted to. I attended various funerals and so on. I found something rather difficult at times, and they were killing animals alive and so on. But you could if you wanted to, and in my day they were only too pleased for you to turn up and see some of their masquerades.
They wore fantastic masks.
Oh yes, and it was as far as West African sculpture is concerned, of course eastern Nigeria is a key place.
Yes. So, Gwelym, to continue, I asked you whether you'd seen rituals and religious performances, and you mentioned that you'd seen some masks. When did you first become interested in art, West African art?
Well, I became interested in African art when I was still at Oxford, when modern art had just hit the place, and Michael Sadler was doing the same sort of thing there, and Roger Fry in Cambridge, and African art came in with this, and with people like Modigliani and so on. And I became interested in it then, and when I went out to Nigeria, I started trying to collect it and trying to record it, because when I was there, it was on the way out. Masquerades cost a lot of money to maintain and provide, and Christianity was taking on, and with Christianity education. The Igbos were very keen on the latter and could only get it through the former. And the Christians were saying that masks were idols and should be destroyed. fundamentally, I think what it amounted to was that there was only a limited amount of money going round, and that should be spent, they thought, on education, on catechists and village schools, rather than on wasteful things like masquerades. But anyhow, masquerades were unpopular and gradually fading. And I found when I was out there that the people who were still trying to provide these masks were only too pleased to get some official white support for them, and were ready to welcome me there and allow me to take photographs as I wished. Then the only problem was that I couldn't take the right kind of photographs, because photography in Nigeria, as done by anthropologists in the good old days, consists of sending the negatives home to be developed. By the time they got home by steamer and through Fort Sticks on carriers, they were pretty grainy by the time they'd been developed. And I found that it was necessary to take your film out of its case, airtight case, load it into the camera, shoot it, and then develop it that evening before it became grainy. The only difficulty about the development was that the temperature was so hot. The water was usually about 70 or so, and with films in those days, this melted the gelatine on the film, so you had to harden them first. However, it was quite easy to pick up the technique, and I soon mastered it, and so that was the way I operated. I took photographs of masquerades, wherever I could get them, and then developed them the same evening. No difficulty about a dark room, because I had a Helson torch, and I merely put a yellow filter over the glass front, and it was dark enough in the back of my rest house to develop anything.
What camera did you use at that time?
Well, I tried one of these Rolleiflexes and stuck to it in the end. I also tried a Leica, but it was much more complicated developing 35mm film. And anyhow, usually you didn't want as much as 35 exposures in a single day. It was a rather waste of the film. So I stuck to a Rolleiflex which had 12 exposures on the film.
You had to do it in the same day? You couldn't keep the film in the camera over 2 days? Or?
No, I took it out of the camera immediately, put it back in its case and shoved the lid on it. And before it could get grainy, hardened it and developed it the same evening. And that's why my negatives now that I've unearthed are still as good as they were in those days.
How many photographs did you take? Have you any idea?
I don't know how many I did, but I got a few, well, I should think well over 500 or so, which I now am building up as a collection for this Cambridge Museum.
Yes, and you published some of them then?
Oh, a lot of them I published with various articles.
Yes, and in a book?
And I wrote a book eventually.
Yes.
But nobody was particularly interested in publishing the kind of book I wanted to publish. In those days, the only book tolerated by publishers was a coffee table idea which covered the whole of West Africa and showed one mask from Dogon and one mask from Gabon, one from Nigeria and so on. Well, I felt, as Haddon did, that the only suitable way of publishing things is to get a whole lot of masks from a single area together so that you can get some idea of the collective value of them.
Did you photograph other things apart from the sort of inanimate?
I photographed the odd film of people farming and working and so on, but they weren't quite so interesting and I didn't take quite so many of them. And I was also operating on a obsolete form of physical anthropology called biometrics, in which you measured people's heads. And I took a lot of photographs of prisoners' heads, and I measured a lot of heads as well. And I now find that this form is completely out of date because it's been, nobody believes that you get anywhere with it.
This was later, you took these photographs after you'd done some training in anthropology, presumably, not at the beginning when you first went out?
Well, I took the photographs when I first went out, but I didn't. In my first tour, I took practically nothing. In my second tour, I took a few, but it was not until my third tour that I was in an area where there were a lot of masks, and I decided I'd have to do something about it.
So you made a visual record with a camera. Did you also collect? You mentioned collecting.
Oh, I collected masks, and most of the ones that I collected originally are now in the Pitt Rivers Museum, Oxford, because I gave it to them when I came on leave in 1937. In those days you could bring an awful lot of loads back with you because you travelled by boat, and the Colonial Office paid for your transport of loads out and back. And I arrived, I remember one time at Plymouth, and unloaded and got onto the train. I think it was 15 cases or more of skulls.
Skulls?
I described them as anthropological specimens, and the customs didn't bother to look at them. But these skulls went with me up to London and eventually up to Oxford to the Department of Anatomy there.
Well, this was part of the physical anthropology.
This was part of my physical anthropology. I also at the same time had a whole lot of masks which went to the Pitt Rivers Museum.
Whose skulls were these?
These were skulls that I'd collected in the bush. In this particular division, Orlu, where I was posted, native doctors attributed a great deal of ill health to the persecution of discontented ghosts. You buried your Auntie Aggie and you hadn't buried her properly, and she was disappointed with you, and she was making you ill to make you realise that you should treat her better. But if you didn't want to treat her better, or if you couldn't afford it, the remedy was to dig up her remains, particularly the skull, which was the important part, and throw it away in that little bit of the forest that was still existing and it was sacred to the tutelary village deity. And these bad bushes, as they call them, were a repository of masses of skulls. And I asked their owners if they had any objection to my removing these skulls to a safer place, and they said no, not at all. So I collected a complete, I think it was about just under 100 of them, and eventually took them home with me when I went on leave and pawned them off from the anatomy department in Oxford. They remained there until Dudley Buxton, who was the chief protagonist of this biometrical method, died, and they abolished his post. And the new professor, LeGros Clark, was only interested in the central nervous system of monkeys, and he threw the whole lot out. They're now in South Kensington, I believe, but I've never checked.
What did the people think you were going to do with these skulls? And did they ask what their destiny
well, they thought that all Europeans were mad anyway.
Yes.
And they thought I was sane in other respects, anyhow respects as far as they were concerned. I treated them reasonably well and so on, and they thought that they might as well humour me, and anyhow, I might want them for medicinal purposes. People wanted all sorts of odd things for turning into medicines.
So they thought you might grind them up and
They provided I didn't use them against them, and they can be sure that I wouldn't. They didn't mind my taking them. And anyhow, I was a district officer, and so they didn't want to be objectionable.
Yes.
But they made no objection. They couldn't care less as far as I could make out. Yes, I went on collecting masks, but the Nigerians produced an antiquities ordinance which defined masks as antiquities, and you couldn't export them. And K.C. Murray, who was the head of the antiquities department, knew exactly what I'd collected because I'd collected them with him. And he took them off me when I left the country, and most of them are now in the Nigerian Museum. He let me bring a few home, and I've got them still with me here. And I'll probably leave them to the museum. I haven't decided what to do with them yet.
Have you got some with you in the house?
Well, I've got some in the house, this sort of thing.
They would wear that, how would they wear that, over the face?
Well, they'd wear this over their face they'd be dressed in a costume which completely hid their form and disguised them. In some areas they let the hands and the feet be exposed, in others they covered them up with cloth.
They were always carved out of wood, were they, like that? Or
mostly. Sometimes they made them out of composite material, leather and wood and clay and things like that. But it was mainly wood, and they were extremely efficient wood carvers, of course.
And they had a ritual significance.
Well, it depended. Your masquerade was usually performed by young men, and in most areas they were members, particular grade, shall we say, in so-called secret societies.
Being secret, they didn't mind you getting hold of
Well, the
these masks?
secret was laid in the masks, but and women were not supposed to see them. But things were getting very lax when I was there, and in any case, they had already got around to selling these masks and trading them. And the secrecy really lay in the character of the actor who was inside the costume and the mask when he was performing.
So there was no worry about you having them and displaying them in British museums?
There was no worry about that at all, no.
That they'd be seen by European women?
No. Women were entitled to see the masks usually when they were on the actors' heads and so on when they were performing, but they were only able to see them as characters. They weren't supposed to see them loose.
What interested you about? I mean, you mentioned that the sort of modern art movement and Modigliani and various Henry Moore and others at that time, they were beginning to get interested in primitive art. But what interested you? Did you feel aesthetically attracted to these?
Well, it's difficult to say. There are fashions that hit universities, and most people are sufficiently, what shall I say, imitative to fall in for the fashion. I liked African art, and I found it appealed increasingly to me. When I was at school, I fell for the Victorian type of art. Things like Hylas and the water nymphs and other proud acquisitions of, say, the Liverpool Public Art Gallery, which have now come back into favour, I believe.
Yes. So you thought that that's a beautiful object, and I would like to...
I thought it was a beautiful object, and I thought I'd like to possess it, and I also felt that I wanted to record the way it was used.
You had the feeling that it was all disappearing very fast,
and it was disappearing very fast because they were throwing them away. And most of the villages you might see a mask in a house, and they'd say, "Oh, this isn't from an old play which we no longer use."
Did you collect anything else apart from masks and skulls?
Yes, I collected various anthropological objects. When I was in the Agoja province, I collected stone celts, which were referred to as there as elsewhere as thunderstones. They were supposed to be thunderbolts.
Yes. There are huge collections of those in the Pit Rivers from all over the world. What was the purpose of collecting those?
Well, for classifying them, they felt that you could tell the difference between them, and they were the only relics left behind by earlier civilizations or cultures.
I see, so sort of
and their distribution in eastern Nigeria was interesting. You only got them on the forest margin, and I got a tremendous lot in one particular area which must have been heavily populated once. I saw one on a shrine for the sky, spirit of the thunder in the sky. And I said, "You get many of these about?" And they said, "Oh yes, we find them in our farming." And I said, "Well, I'll give you threepence for each one you bring me." Well, I thought that was a expensive enough bribe to bring any that were around, but I had to reduce it to a penny because they brought me so many. And I took them all back, and they're now somewhere in the Pitt Rivers Museum. But when I moved to an adjacent area, the people and I couldn't see a single one.
You were obviously by this time beginning to get interested in anthropology. Had you? What sort of first attracted you to that discipline?
Well, I never heard about anthropology until I went on to the Colonial Services course that had just begun to operate at Oxford. And I was hooked on anthropology by R.R. Merritt. He was a brilliant lecturer at the time, and stimulated my interest in it. And afterwards I decided I'd go back to Oxford and take a course in anthropology. The Colonial Office and the Nigerian government encouraged its people to take various courses, either in law or anthropology or similar ancillary subjects. And I hoped it might also help to extend my leave, which it did on the second but not the first occasion. So I took a course I think I gained a certificate in anthropology from Oxford.
What year was that?
That was probably in the year 27, 8 and 29, 30, I think.
So you went twice?
I went twice, or 21, 30, 33 or something like that. Can't remember exactly, but it was about that time.
So you'd been in Africa for about 5 years?
I'd been in Africa for I went back on my first leave and took the beginning of the course and applied for extension of leave and was refused. And then on my next leave, I went back again. And the leaves occurred every sort of 2 years. Sort of thing.
Who were the people teaching that course in Oxford at that time?
Oh, well, Oxford anthropology was extremely amusing. Looking back on it, it was like all Gaul divided into 3 parts. And the reason for that was that the 3 people who taught it, or at least 2 of them, couldn't stand each other and were not prepared to communicate practically. You had Merritt, who wrote books on mana and animism, who taught the social side.
He was the rector of...
He was a classicist like Fraser, and anthropology was his hobby, and he taught it in his spare time, so to speak. Then there was Balfour, who was the curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum. He had a private income of his own, that's why he could afford to be so. And Merritt and Balfour avoided each other. And the third member of the trio was Professor Thompson, who was professor of anatomy in the anatomy school, and he taught physical anthropology. And there was an unfortunate dog's body, Tom Penniman, who eventually replaced Balfour as curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum. But in my day, he was supporting himself by the few supervisions he could give in anthropology, and supervising for each of these 3 parts. Then you had an exam which covered the 3.
What were these particular people like? What was Balfour like as a person and lecturer?
Well, Balfour, if you were interested in material culture and objects, without reference very much to the social side that they might be associated with, he was very good. But he was mainly of the classificatory kind, and very much a Pitt Rivers man.
Yeah.
Merritt, on the other hand, was purely religion and nothing else. London, of course, was even more amusing at the time, because they had the same exam for 2 different schools of anthropology. London School of Economics taught one sort with Malinowski and Seligman and Firth and so on. And University College taught about diffusionism and so on. And they set the same exam, but their pupils had to answer the right questions.
Balfour was a nice man, as far as I can gather from the...
Well, Balfour was quite a nice man. I didn't see very much of him because they never had you round, they merely lectured to you, and that's all you saw of them. Penniman was the one I associated with.
But
I used to go down with him and dig for mammoth bones and so on in Welsh caves.
He always looked rather a glum character in his photographs. Was he glum in life, or...?
Well, he wasn't, no, he was quite cheerful in life. When he wasn't in the Pitt Rivers, he went down to a farm in the Gower Peninsula and spent his holidays there. But he was always a loner.
And Marrett, you said, was a brilliant lecturer.
Marrett was a brilliant lecturer, but the trouble with Marrett was in later years he became completely senile. I went to a most embarrassing anthropological meeting there where he introduced the lecturer and went on talking for 3/4 of the time allocated for the lecture. And we had to be out of the lecture theatre by a certain time. This had been told to the lecturer in advance, and he rather brilliantly cut his lecture down to 1/4 of an hour.
Who was the person who you mentioned lectured, and he'd given the same lectures for many years, and the only person in the audience was his wife, who used to sit in the front row?
Oh, I don't know that. I don't remember that one. That's not one of my stories.
It's a very nice story, and he would used to say, he'd given this lecture so often and seen his wife knitting in the front row. She used to come to all his lectures because no one else used to come and sit there knitting. So he would sort of turn and say, "And now, my dear Helen or Anne or whoever it was, we can see." And she would nod her head and go on knitting. But this isn't one of your stories.
No, that's not one of my stories.
So, at that time, what did you specialise in anthropology, or was it just a general certificate course?
Well, on the certificate course I got through on the strength of a report. I'd written a reorganisation report on a tribe in one of my divisions. That was this thing that carried the day because I committed all sorts of crimes in the physical anthropology. I classified a Japanese skull, I remember, as an African one. Did various other terrible errors of that sort. Well, there was a bit of archaeology in it as well. And I have the distinction, or I had, I don't know who you've got now in the department, but I had the distinction of being the only social anthropologist who knew what the archaeologists were talking about. Because I alone had been taught a little bit of archaeology.
Yes. Were there any other anthropologists or people who went on to do anthropology in the course with you at that time, or was it a very small course?
It was a very small course, and most of the people on it were colonial people like myself. Some people, for instance, called Culwick, a man who wrote a book on East Africa, and then retired to Southern Rhodesia, as it then was, and wrote a book saying Britannia Waves the Rules.
So yes, I've seen a copy of that book.
But he and his wife were there.
Yes.
And Rupert East, who wrote a book on the Tiv in eastern Nigeria, he took the course at the same time as I did.
Yes. So this course didn't disenchant you with anthropology, you were still interested?
I was still interested, and I also at the same time, on the second occasion when I was on this course, the second part, I used to drive Marjorie Perham, of all people, up to seminars at Malinowski's course at the LSE.
Oh, well, you mentioned there two very famous names. Can we start with Marjorie Perham? She's obviously a terribly distinguished lady whose books are in much demand even nowadays. What sort of person, apart from a driver, what sort of person was she?
Well, she was a brilliant young woman and extremely handsome. And she graduated in history at Oxford during the war. And then she was sent for a couple of years to lecture to the troops before demobilisation. And then she became a lecturer at Sheffield University, where she lectured to one of my Nigerian colleagues, Culwick. And then she became a fellow at St Hugh's. And she put colonial history on the map. And the Calwicks introduced me to her, and I saw her when she came out to Nigeria to write a book on Nigeria. But in order to get this grant to go to Nigeria, it was, I think, Wenegren or one of these American foundations. Malinowski had persuaded them to subsidize research in the field for anthropology, and he had a very brilliant group of people attending this seminar at the LSE. All the ones who became professors later on, Nardell, Fortes, the two Wilsons, Oberg, who faded out, and later on Lucy Mayer, what's his name?
Raymond Firth, Audrey Richards.
No, not Firth. Firth was a lecturer already there. But Audrey Richards is the one I was trying to think of. But all those people were there. And Marjorie Penham was forced much to her fury because she felt she was a historian and not an anthropologist. But in order to receive the grant, part of the conditions were they should receive instruction from Malinowski before they went into the field, which was a useful way of bringing money into the LSE.
I see. So
and she had to attend these seminars, and I drove her up and attended too.
What were the seminars like? They were legendary.
Well, the only one I can remember, they were dismal, very dismal affairs, because Malinowski knew nothing about Africa and didn't know what sort of questions to raise afterwards. And he'd let the person who's reading the paper go on, and the people in the audience asking any questions they could think of. And if the man reading the paper, usually the ones I saw were pretty dull, there was very little you could talk about at all.
So instead of this scintillating, sparkling occasion which the myths tell us about, the great Malinowski seminar, it was rather a drab affair.
Well, I feel that if they'd had a seminar on Melanesian things, he'd have come out in a big way. But as you've read in his book on culture, or whatever it is, where he refers to Africa, he knew nothing about it. And the place, and had no intention of reading up about it either.
Did you get any impression of him as a person? He's supposed
No,
to be...
he didn't inspire me at all. I knew that he'd written brilliant books, but I judged him from his appearance at the seminars, and I was rather disappointed.
Was there anyone else who you were impressed with or formed any friendship with at that time?
Well, I liked very much the Wilsons and Nardell. I saw a good deal of Nardell. I didn't see much of Fortes. He wasn't around much, but he was there. And and Firth, of course, was already a lecturer on the staff.
Yes. Nardell, what nationality was Nardell? Was he...
Central European, Austrian, I think.
He had some connection with Australia, didn't he? Or was it he went to Australia?
I think he went to Australia afterwards. He went to Australia afterwards and wrote a book when he got there.
Yes.
But he wrote a brilliant book on Bida.
Yes.
Which is one of the many Nigerian classics.
Yes. So, having driven up and down the A40 or whatever it was from Oxford, you then went back to, well, you were just on leave, you went back to West Africa. This must have been now taking you into the early 30s.
Yes.
Was there a feeling in West Africa that things were changing and that perhaps, it was well before the winds of change and so on, but that perhaps the British Empire was not destined to last forever?
Well, I can only speak of what I encountered in the eastern Nigeria rather than anywhere else. But certainly at that time it was a reaction from the shock of these women's riots that had happened in 27, 28. And the feeling that we must pacify the women at all costs and we must consider them. Then later, from about 37, 39 onwards, you've got a feeling towards change and independence, and a lot of people came round, including Zik. Zik was beginning to build up.
What was Zik? He was a person.
Zik, I'm sorry, Zikiwe was his name. He was an Igbo politician who was a brilliant newspaper editor, and he was able to use the newspaper for the first time in Nigeria to mobilize the English reading intellectuals behind him.
You mentioned the women's riots and protests. Did the British take any notice in relation to taxation? Did they stop the offensive taxes?
No, because the women rioted to say that women should not pay tax.
Yes.
Well, they did pay tax on the western side because they were extremely wealthy, the honourable market women.
Yes.
But women in the eastern region never paid tax. It was, we had to go around preaching this at all costs. They must never pay tax. They won their case completely in that respect. And of course, it was a period in England when the British people were shocked by these riots. First of all, Amritsar. Amritsar hit them badly as far as India was concerned. And then in Nigeria, you suddenly had women being shot by troops. 36 of them.
Yes, terrible.
More or less in cold blood, when they were unarmed. They were said to be attacking the treasury with sticks, but they were really demonstrating, and you don't shoot up demos. But in the good old days, the rules of dispersing riots was you've got somebody to come out and read the Riot Act, which nobody could understand, and then order the crowd to disperse. And then if the crowd didn't disperse, you ordered the troops to fire. And the troops were told not to fire above their heads because that would merely encourage them to come on, but to fire to kill. And they did.
No one was.
After that, of course, things changed, and police riot drill was very well developed in Nigeria. And when I was involved in a women's riot later on, we had no trouble at all. We danced with them until they got tired of dancing, and then arrested a few of them as they were going home.
What date was that you were dancing with the women in a riot?
Oh, this was concerning a forest reserve in Bendi. And the local people had got the wrong idea into their heads, and we couldn't get it out of them that we were trying to take their land. What we were trying to do was to free the land from the forest reserve so they could use it. However, they told a large number of women who bought clay for their pots from this particular area that they must come and demonstrate, i.e. riot, against it. And they laid on a riot for us. And it was a very pleasant occasion in which the policemen and everybody else danced with the women as they sang and gradually edged them out of the market and so on. It had been rather awkward to begin with because the women were between the police and their rifles, which had been piled into the market. But anyhow, we gradually sorted that out. And because we were perfectly friendly and so on, nothing happened. We let them work it out as you can in a demo. It wasn't such a big riot, of course, as these, the Abar riots, so-called.
Yes.
And then when they were arrested, we found that they were not the people who were concerned in this forest reserve at all. There were many people who came from somewhere else.
All this talk of women and rioting and so on, you are now taking the mid-30s towards the late 30s. You are now aged about 32, 33, and you are still unmarried. I presume that it was the case there as elsewhere in the empire that you were discouraged from getting married too early because you wouldn't have enough income to support a wife. Was that the case in the colonial service or not?
In theory, I don't know how much in fact, but while you were a cadet, that is for the first 3 years of your service, you were not supposed to have your wife out. In fact, you're not supposed to be married. But I know quite a number of cadets who were married and who had their wives out.
Yes.
But it was not supposed to be accepted. And you were discouraged from having any children out there, of course.
Yes.
Whatever your age.
Whether you were married or not.
Or whether you were married or not.
I think at this point we ought to bring in the other important person in your life, Ursula. So we got to the point where I was pointing out that it was very difficult to get married early on. But how did, well, let's turn to Ursula Jones. Ursula, how did you meet this eligible bachelor from West Africa? Were you in West Africa yourself?
No, I'd never been there. It was considered a black hole in Calcutta by my family because a relative long before died of yellow fever, so they would never have thought of me going there. It was my cousin, who was a junior officer to Gwilym for a whole tour or more in a fairly lonely station, and they must have got to know each other pretty well. He was also a bachelor. And he did a bit of matchmaking when he came home on leave. He'd mentioned this G.I. Jones he'd like me to meet, though he didn't explain why, and tried to arrange it, but that failed. And then finally he was posted to Mauritius. I was sorry because I'd always been rather fond of him, but he'd ignored me. And many years had passed in between that. I was then 25, and I'd really first known him and liked him when I was about 18. So he arranged for us to meet the day before he went to Mauritius in London. Gwilym was, you were invigilating some kind of...
Oh, I had an exhibition on at the Colonial Office of Nigerians' masks.
And I was working in...
Photographs of them.
I was working in Australia House and only had an hour off for lunch. And in the early years office, it was just about to, blow up because this was August, perhaps July,
39.
August 39.
I see.
You had a job at the Air Ministry.
Yes, and
The Australian Air Ministry.
I was told to look out for him by my cousin who was driving up from Sussex. And I was a bit intrigued, although I wanted to see the cousin, really. But I was a bit intrigued because this man was described as a rugger player with sensitive features. So, eventually we had lunch at the Strand Palace Hotel as being the nearest place we could eat to my office. And it was very noisy, and I really didn't notice Gwilym at all because I was interested in the fact that the cousin was off next day. And I think you did get my phone number.
You gave me your phone
Oh,
number.
I gave you my phone number. I think you asked for it.
No, I think you wanted another meal.
Anyway, subsequently, you asked me to the ballet. And I was really going to spend the weekend with my aged parents in Sussex, but I was sufficiently interested to ring up as daughters do and say, shan't be coming this weekend. And so from then we really had very little time to decide, because you were standing by as soon as war was declared to go back. And it didn't take us more than a few weeks to decide, did it?
No.
Just decide to get married?
Yes.
In a few weeks?
And we sent a telegram to this chap who'd been so clever, to whom I had previously, and still was, very devoted, saying something like, what was it we said? Marrying precipitously, I think we said. Very successful, marrying precipitously. And what was nice, he subsequently married a delightful French Mauritian girl about 2 years later. So everybody was happy, and we used to meet on leave afterwards.
So was it a sensitive rugger player that you met, or?
Well, I was swept off all right. I always wanted to travel. I never wanted to stay in England and cook. I'd already had some travelling. I'd been, as it were, around the world once, but I looked forward to going to West Africa. I didn't have any doubts, but my family were pretty horrified. I'm in the white man's grave again. But obviously one doesn't consult one's parents. And the war was very decisive. We were together in the flat that I was sharing with a relative, another young cousin, on the day war was declared, remember?
Yes. And
he'd been staying there for a week or a few days, and I think we really got to know each other when he suddenly developed an attack, you know how they fall upon you immediately, of malaria, about which I knew nothing. And he sort of said, "You better," it wasn't my bed, it was a sort of put you up couch or something in the room that my cousin and I shared, this female cousin. And he said, "You better put a raincoat on Macintosh between me and the mattress, because I'm going to sweat right through. I'm going to have a terrible sweating." And so we, really got to know each other pretty well then. And arranged to get married as quickly as possible, but unfortunately your father died, which made it very sad for
quickly as possible, because I was due to return to Nigeria.
He was standing by to return.
The idea was that you'd get back before
Exactly. If I hadn't married him, I wouldn't have known to go with him.
Well, my leave had expired. That was the main reason. And then, instead of going back in time, I developed appendicitis and had to have my appendix out and had to spend another month. And I had to go to the doctor and say, for God's sake, pass me as fit, because if I stay any longer in the UK, I'll have to pay UK income tax.
So you hurried
Sad
off.
thing was, he'd spent all his money on leave, as they did in those days. You lived on tick, really.
Mm.
You could explain that. You bought all the things you'd need in advance.
I was
on
wondering
tick.
about that, all those tins of Oxford marmalade.
So
you were
I met
sending
him.
out.
He had this extraordinary Ford pickup van which rattled about London with a great
I'd driven home across the desert in it.
Which desert?
Sahara.
for the third time.
I see.
Not the third
Oh, I
time,
see the car across. I thought you meant Ursula. I was
No, no.
Yeah.
trying to see.
I never got on that drive. I was promised it. I never got it.
So you were rattling around London in this
Yeah.
large car.
Being stopped at the parks because it looked like a commercial vehicle. It was a very extraordinary looking thing to be driving in London, wasn't it?
Well, it had, in those days, you could fit any size tires because of the mud guards being high above the wheels.
Mm.
So to cross through sand, you fitted balloon tires. So they're enormous balloon-like things.
You must have looked very odd in
Looked very odd.
London.
But you could put rings around taxi drivers because they only had very low-geared vehicles in those days.
Hmm. So your parents didn't actively oppose it, they just were unhappy at the thought of you going to an early
I
grave.
think they thought it was better than the other possible son-in-law I had in mind, which they were horrified at the thought of, because he didn't even have a British nationality. That was dreadful. Then we discovered that Gwilym and I each had very respectable elderly uncles. One was an admiral and one was a retired colonel, and they knew each other in Buckinghamshire or somewhere.
They were in Wokingham, and the Admiral was Lord Mayor of Wokingham. And he was another member of the town council.
This was all right, you see,
Ah.
because my uncle passed this as a relative of his would be all right. So, well, we didn't really ask them, did we? We
Announced.
had to get married quickly, because I wouldn't have been able to follow him, and I really would have been stuck, as it turned out, for 5 years.
Hmm.
And
Did you have, I mean, there must have been much pacing up and down, having to take a decision on so little information.
Not
or-
really, no.
or you an
I think I
impetuous
decided very quickly. I went to North Wales for the first time to meet his mother, a poor woman. She'd just been widowed from a long and happy marriage. And I think she was very shattered, because I think she thought she had her only child, although in West Africa, to look after her. And he'd never been, well, he'd taken lots of girls home, but never really appeared to be too interested in any of them. Nothing had come of it. So when we told the poor woman with very little preliminaries that we were going to get married quite quickly, she dropped her plate. I don't think she ever quite forgave me for snatching him at that point.
Had Gwilym explained to you the sort of conditions you'd be going to, for
Yes,
instance?
yes. Well, I asked a lot of questions.
Like, that he mentioned that you weren't allowed to have children in West Africa, so...
With war having just been declared, and the only war I could remember, things seemed so bizarre anyway that didn't appear to be relevant at the time.
But how were we at that time supposed not to? There was some
Oh
contraception.
yes, contraception was not exactly straightforward. Indeed
No.
not.
But
No,
Maurice Stopes was known by all educated people.
Did the Colonial Service provide
absolutely
contraception?
No.
money for any kind of consultation either.
Hmm.
Actually, I think we succeeded rather well, because when, after 2 years, I became, needed leave, because 18 months, he said previously 2 years, but it was 18 months who needed leave,
Hmm.
and I really got rather anemic or run down and needed to go down to wanted to come back to Britain, but had to go to the Cape, there being no transport to Britain. I was then just rather neatly pregnant, although I didn't know it.
Hmm.
So I think we managed rather successfully.
That
but it
was against the
difficult.
rules. You shouldn't have become pregnant, presumably.
Well,
No,
she shouldn't have
shouldn't
had
have
the
done
child.
that,
Well,
yeah.
shouldn't have had
Shouldn't
the
have.
child in Nigeria.
Hmm.
You often became pregnant.
Oh, I see. Oh, you could go
In
and...
fact, there was
Tell
a
the story.
lovely story about the governor, Sir Hugh Clifford, entertaining in Government House a number of young wives who were on the boat to go home, and the boat called at Lagos, and they were invited to dine at Government House. And he was married to Mrs. de Lapiture, he said to them, ladies, you've only just come out of the country. Why are you leaving your husband so soon and going home? Nobody knew what the hell to say because you didn't talk about these things in those days. And Mrs. de Lapeter, or at least Lady Clifford as she then was said to remark, "A pregnant silence."
I think the government were very unreasonable. But
What
I suppose they felt they didn't have right medical services, and certainly some of the doctors were like ship's doctors, pretty unpredictable.
So it was the health aspect that they were worried
Yes, it was, I imagine, entirely. And I suppose it would have cluttered things up. Administrative officers wouldn't have been so keen to travel, trekking around with children. But subsequently we were allowed to bring this child born in Cape Town back for a brief time. Because of the war, only because of the war.
But people afterwards had their children out there.
Then later, about 2.5 years later, when I was pregnant again in England, we got special permission for me to return with him pregnant, and they posted him to some outlandish division in the Cameroons, northern Cameroons, Mamfe, which he would love to have served in, because he'd never had a chance to go up there. But of course, when we arrived and found this posting, it was quite impossible. I was already, whatever it was, 6 months pregnant, and it would have been, there wasn't even a doctor. There might have been an African doctor, but there was no hospital. So he was stuck back in Airbar, which was not so interesting for him.
What about when the children began to get a bit older? Were you faced with the awful choice that...
Well, having 2 children and having had a rather difficult time with the second one, born in Abar, who was 10 weeks pregnant, and Charlie nearly didn't survive, just through being so premature, and who knows why. It may have been the climate. I travelled out, you see, 6 months pregnant. I was nosily reading a letter over his shoulder that he'd had from Jack Trevor here, who'd been corresponding with him about the physical anthropological measurements, which we had great fun doing together. You know, he would have the prisoners out in the evening with calipers and measure their heads, and I would write down the...
So you were doing...
Yes, well, I mean, I was sort of rubbish, and it did turn out to be rubbish, but still it was quite amusing in the evenings. Anyway, Jack Trevor was comparing figures and notes with him, and at the bottom there was a PS. I can see it clearly now, saying there's a lecture in social anthropology here. I think it might suit you, why don't you apply? So I said, why don't you? He wasn't very keen to, because I don't think at that time you did see the end of British rule. You may think so, but I think we were very happy
at that time they were going to have a registrar of cooperative societies, and the eastern and the western regions had been told to submit people who they would suggest should go to Cyprus to be trained in cooperation. And I was nominated for the eastern region, and it was a toss-up whether I went to Cyprus
young children in Cyprus
or not. Fortunately, it went to the western one, so I didn't have to worry. But when I came here, I had to tell the secretary here whether or not I'd accept the post, and I had to arrange for it to count as a transfer. I was transferred. It was considered employment to which I could be transferred, as it involved mainly teaching of cadets. Hardly anybody reading anthropology in those days, and about 50 cadets.
But the real thing was, when we left Nigeria on this occasion, he having applied for the job rather unwillingly, he was perfectly happy. The only thing was, he had then become a senior district officer, which would have, he realised, been more boring. He would have been sitting more in an office rather than bumming around the bush. But we didn't know, and that's how we managed to bring 1 or 2 masts back, not realising we wouldn't be returning with them, just for leave. And there was a bit of a fight over you can tell them about the government wanting to keep you. The governor put up a protest when you were offered the job.
They wanted to keep me, but I got Glyn Daniel, who was then secretary of the faculty board, to get the university to write and say they wanted to keep me too. And it was considered to have me, yes, that it would be very valuable to have me to lecture to cadets here, as I'd already myself been on this cadets course earlier on.
I was rather pleased the governor had to be
Overruled.
it's not often they were.
Mm.
But we didn't know what we were going to get. And what was funny was that the loads that we'd packed up to leave until we returned couldn't be sorted out because there was no one to sort them. And they all came back regardless. All the extraordinary kitchen stuff that our Igbo cook had used in his, mud kitchen, all arrived in Cambridge. Everything. That's great.
I hope it went to a museum. Why do you say you didn't know that you were going back there? Because presumably if you'd applied for a job...
But it hadn't been sorted out, you see.
I
There'd been an argument as to whether or not he would be allowed to
I see.
leave. But of course...
I wasn't due for retirement.
No.
It's 43.
It was at the time when they were trying to get people to retire, but you had to be a bit older.
Mm.
And I'd reached the stage where they still wanted to hang on to me.
Well, I think they thought he was going to make quite a useful senior administrator. Why not?
Mm.
Most of his contemporaries who stuck it did.
Mm.
Got knighted and all.
So good on. Did you feel that it was all over? I mean, by that time when you left, when you read the footnote to the letter, you had the sense that...
I thought this would be better. I didn't want to have myself in England with my family and Gwilym out there. I'd had a miserable time being separated from my first child by leaving her in Cape Town. And it wasn't on. So I think he gradually realised that it was an impossible sort of life. Others were doing it, but it didn't work.
Yes.
Well, what also affected the position was that your salary wasn't made at all compatible with the difficulty of maintaining children in England. And all the people who had children retired and took advantage of the conditions of retirement.
I would suggest that was later.
Well, this is when...
later, after you...
Well, after I'd gone, but this was the beginning. This was the beginning, and I'd have gone back to
What
this.
was miserable, though, financially, was that, of course, it wasn't regarded... he wasn't old enough to get any pension until he was old enough to retire from the university.
I was due to get
Didn't
my
get a
pension on
penny.
the retirement age. The retirement age was 45.
And he was
then.
43.
I was 43, so I couldn't do it that way.
Did worry us a bit.
The Colonial
But you're
Office
going to get a
said
job.
the Colonial Office said I could keep my pension rights,
Yes.
but that turned out, as it happened, that I could only draw my pension when I retired to the retiring age from university, which was 60.
Had a university job, okay, but it was very poorly paid at that point.
Was it?
And we hadn't had to worry too much in Nigeria. The cost of living wasn't high and the salary was good.
Well, my salary as a lecturer at Cambridge, and they added it up because of my age, which was 40-something, you see, was £250 a year,
Yes.
plus something or other for fellowship allowance.
It was a great pinch, I may say, with 2 children.
Was it?
And I think it was another
Very little money,
£250 for in lieu of fellowship allowance, so it amounted to about 500.
So it was about 500. What would a reasonable house have cost at that time, do you think? Did you buy a house?
Well, I bought a house for
My father helped.
2,500.
But we were very, very skint for a long time.
5 times the
Never
salary.
left me, I think.
Yes. It has impressed itself on you. It was very difficult the first few years.
Well, the first 2 years were hell because England and Cambridge was still rationing. You got 1 egg, and
didn't get anything
you
on
had
Fridays.
points. And undergraduates,
Get the eggs
the
too.
story is correct, undergraduates could carry a certificate from their tutor saying that they couldn't wear a gown, and you had to wear a gown in those days if you
Yes.
props saw you, as you'd exhausted your coupon allowances. You hadn't got any clothing coupons left.
Yes.
And they abolished their wearing of
It really
gowns.
was quite a struggle. I used to share a hat with a neighbour.
A hat.
A hat, because I was bidden, although Gwilym was only
How can
a
you share a hat? You
member.
walked along in parallel. with
Well,
this
no,
hat
because
over
we
the
only
two.
wore a hat when we were bidden to college. She went to Magdalen and I went to Jesus once in the winter to a sherry party and once in the summer to a outdoor party. And it was essential to wear a hat, and hats were expensive and we didn't wear them otherwise. I mean, that was really how we
Just
did.
hope that no one
And we had, of
be
course,
at both colleges
there
and
were
see you.
second-hand prams and things. But it was lovely all to be together. It was, no regrets.
You were bidden to college. This was a formal bidding of the wives to college, was it?
It was so rare. It was quite an exciting social occasion for me.
Before we leave that part of Africa, Ursula, we heard about Willem's life. What were your impressions coming from? You said you'd been around the world.
It was very exciting. Unfortunately, looking back, I feel I didn't make nearly enough of it. But we were in a bush station, and there was just one other expatriate. We never called them expatriates, did we? But a Scots doctor, a rather dour Scots doctor who'd got his wife and family in England. But I couldn't really get to know many of the, say, clerks' wives and people, because they really didn't speak any English. So we won't say everybody was speaking pidgin English, but the sort of the women that I would like to have got to know, I didn't. So in a way, I suppose it was rather lonely. Subsequently, when I was the second tour, when I had a baby out there, that was different. But
did you ever get to feel you ever got to know any of the Africans at all? You mentioned the language difficulty.
I suppose
Was a huge
really
gap?
only when I was with you. On sort of, I used to go around and sit in native courts and listen to this bedlam. The bedlam that he referred to earlier was something that was a very good training for later years, because no amount of noise can distract him from what he's thinking of now, because it used to be absolutely amazing the noise they made, and he would just go on calmly writing his judgments. And then we travelled a lot, and that was great fun. And we had exciting incidents of driver ants walking through our camp beds and all over our mosquito net in the middle of the night in mud rest houses, and it was very exciting sort of life. I enjoyed it enormously. I enjoyed it more than any other part, I think.
So you were absolutely split. You would have liked to have stayed, but with the idea of the children.
Well, having two children, I didn't want to live in a separate... If we'd been allowed to have the children there, that would have been fine, and I think they would have been all right.
You wouldn't have found it difficult to bring up children?
Well, until they needed education, I don't see why it should have been a problem. It did seem unreasonable.
But provided you could keep them free from malaria with drugs, they didn't get nearly so many nose and throat complaints as they got in a temperate country like this.
There were rather sort of exciting moments, like Gwilym would bring a leper back in a hurry. Somebody wanted to transfer them to the leper settlement, and I was with this very small baby sort of sitting in the front of this van, and I would find that the chap in the back was a leper. I did wonder if this was wise, but of course realised, learning by experience, that leprosy is not all that infectious. I was very much under your... You really had all the answers. He'd been running his house out there for 14 years, and I went along very much with his decisions.
You didn't find the difficulty that sometimes has been found in that case, where he'd got his establishment, he's trained up, he's got the
you're
cook,
quite
and
right.
all these
His cook did have a miserable time, and he was a wonderful, faithful old servant. It really, having a madam was just too much for him. It was
I
very
had
sad.
to pension him off, but he had, and he died fairly soon after, one of these aorta things that burst in his neck.
Fortunately not while we were there, but on leave. But that was one of the sadnesses. I felt, he and my mother-in-law, I felt I had treated badly. The poor cook, he couldn't cope, because he'd never really been a cook anyway. He was horrified by some of the things I thought we needed. Nice chap too. Servants were exciting and fun, and we sometimes argued about them, but they were awfully nice. I think he was easy people to like, and they had such a good sense of humour.
Who did you meet any interesting people, I mean Europeans, when you were out there? I think the name Julian Huxley was mentioned. How did you come across?
Well, Julian Huxley came out with the secretaries of the faculty boards of Oxford and secretary of the University of Oxford and Cambridge to advise on the establishment of a university for British West Africa. They recommended it should be at Ibadan. The Gold Coast immediately said they must have one too. And so they had theirs as well. But they came round to Omaha to see the local chiefs and so on. And amongst them was Julian Huxley. And I was able to take him and show him some of the local art things in my division.
What sort of man was he? Was he
well, he was mainly interested in African art. Not interested particularly in this thing, and as soon as he'd try and bring the meeting to a close as possible and say, now can we see something?
And he was impressed by your knowledge of it, surprised, I think, and then later, in 1939, suggested you wrote a book. You were horrified on West African art, and I remember you saying to me afterwards, what a ridiculous idea, I couldn't possibly write on anything but a very small area. I was so impressed with the idea of you even knowing him.
Well, he did eventually say, when you come to it, well, I said, if you can find a publisher. I said, and I told him what I wanted to write on. And eventually he did. The nearest he could get to it was an article in the Geographic magazine, that magazine.
Yes,
I published a small article on Nigerian art in that.
Do you
but
remember
that was the nearest approach, and after that, as far as that art was concerned, I let it drop and waited until I retired, practically.
That snooty governor, not that he was anybody very special, afterwards Lord Milnerton.
Lord Milner?
Milverton.
Oh, Milverton.
He, of course, when governors travelled in the bush, they turned you out of the only decent house that they could stay in, and you had to push off into the rest house, and of course do your stuff with them. And he was a very anaesthetic sort of man, and he saw that beautiful little Ubum and looked at it with great scorn, you know. I mean, we had the house, Gwilym arranged his bush houses most beautifully. We had all sorts of lovely African things.
You pointed at something. What
this one here.
Bring it up.
Can you bring it over and we can have a look?
She was in the house. We left the house looking as nice as we could with all our lovely African things. And this, I don't know what adjective to use for the
harmless wonder.
Yes, but he said, looking at his ADC or whatever the chap was, oh, that does solve the problem of what to do with her arms. And he obviously hadn't any kind of opinion on her whatsoever. And I was very indignant, wasn't I, being turned out of my house for this butch sort of chap. But I don't think I ever met anyone interesting, British interesting like that. I had a few friends, but...
Well, Casey Murray.
Oh, yes. I never saw enough of him. Only when we went to Lagos.
He was an art expert, more or less built up the Nigerian.
The real reason why you ever published that first art book, because you felt he would have done it if he'd lived longer and had more energy.
He died.
He was killed.
Well, he was perfectly healthy, and he retired and lived in Lagos in a fisherman's hut. And he was killed when he was going down in a motor lorry to open a museum at Benin, because the Nigerian government had decided to change from driving on the left-hand side of the road to driving on the right. And none of the drivers being able to read all right appreciated this. And Murray ended up in a terrible car crash on the road to Benin.
Two buses.
And was killed.
I see. That's sad.
Prematurely, poor man.
Coming back to, arriving at Cambridge in 1947?
1946, December 1946.
That was just before the terrible winter, was that?
Yeah, I went through the terrible winter, and it was so cold that I thought I'd got malaria when I was really freezing.
You and I arrived...
And when I got malaria, I thought it was I was merely being cold.
We arrived about the same time. I, as a little boy of 7 from Assam, and to that winter, and you slightly older. And who was it at the department then? You mentioned Glyn Daniel.
Well, the department was very small in those days. We'd got... Glyn Daniel was secretary of the faculty board. Graham Clark was there.
And professor.
No, he wasn't professor. Dorothy Garrett, I think, was professor.
Quite young.
And Hutton was anthropology professor.
J.H. Hutton, yes.
J.H. Hutton, the Naga expert. And he and Glyn used to settle faculty board matters over lunch, more or less.
He was chairman of the faculty board, was he?
He was chairman and head of the faculty.
I see. Yes, it was tiny.
And Graham Clark was the sort of big noise in the archaeology side. and Dorothy Garrett when she was in Cambridge, where she was doing a lot of digging, of course, in France. And Charles McBurney was here.
Ah, there are a lot of archaeologists.
Oh, a lot of archaeologists. I got the job because Hutton had offered the job to some anthropological friend of his. I don't know who he was. I can't remember the name now.
It wasn't J.P. Mills?
No. He was a young man, about my age. Well, he's relatively young. And then the university found he'd done this and said, you can't do this without advertising it. You must advertise it. So you had to write to this chap and say, you'll have to wait until it's been advertised before you can have it. By which time this man took and got a job somewhere else. And Hutton was left without anybody.
Jack Trevor wrote that in your
And so I was offered the job. And it was a bit, I came to see him, and there was a difficult time because there were two Huttons and two professors at the same time in Cambridge, and I went to the wrong professor's house. And the professor's wife was quite used to people arriving unannounced at her house, for her husband had asked to come to lunch and hadn't told her. So she seated me down, and it wasn't until the wrong Professor Hutton turned up that the error was discovered, by which time I was rather late for lunch with the real Huttons.
I see. And when you did find the real Huttons, what sort of man was J.H.
Well,
Hutton?
he was a cheerful little man, very active, rather like one of these border terriers, rushing around the whole time. And he was very good with dogs. You know the story about him and his dog. We've always had dogs in this museum.
Yes.
He had a beautiful golden retriever, which was very well trained. And the professor's room was then in what is now the room used as a sort of common room where you drink coffee, but it was the boardroom then and the professor's room. And there was a large tablecloth over his table, which he used as a desk. And the dog was trained to go underneath this desk and be shrouded by the tablecloth and go to sleep while the professor was in the building. And if you want to know if the professor had gone home or was in the building, you checked on the dog. And an old lady came and called, wanted to see the professor. The museum attendant said, well, I'll come and see if the professor's still in the museum, madam. And he went along and went to the professor's room, lifted up the tablecloth, looked under the table, said, I'm sorry, the professor's gone home.
So he was a slightly eccentric character. What sort of lecturer was he? Was he a good lecturer?
I never went to his lecture, but all I knew when I came here was that the precise course that I'd had at Oxford 30 years or whatever it was previously was being administered as anthropology at this place. There was a course on material culture, and he said to me, you will of course be, said that this was the next year, you will be giving my lecture on material culture. And I said, well, I don't know anything about material culture. And he said, well, you can have my notes. And he lent me his notes, and they were marvellous. There were about 4 pages. Lecture 1, fire pistons, nothing else at all. And then lecture so-and-so, voice disguise, and so on, completely sort of Balfour stuff from the Pitt Rivers. And at the same time, Jack Trevor, who was then the physical anthropology lecturer, went sick and was off duty for God knows how long, and I was told I'd have to give his lectures. So I routed out my lectures that I'd recorded, had been given to me at Oxford previously, and gave those lectures. And the people I gave them to were these unfortunate cadets. They were the only people reading anthropology, and they were in their 2nd or 3rd year, were Leonhardt and Cunnison, who now retired. But they were the only students here at that particular time.
Just 2 students?
What?
Just 2 students?
2 white students, yes, and the rest about 60 cadets. And I had to give about 60 lectures to these damn cadets for the good of their souls. They were, because in order to qualify for a lecturer's salary, so I later understood, you had to give the average number of lectures. And Hutton had so arranged it that these cadets should get 60 lectures in anthropology. They were getting lectures in economics and in all sorts of other subjects as well. I soon discovered with them that there was no point in lecturing them, they ought to read a few books. So I turned these lectures into what eventually ended up as seminars and supervised them. And I drew my supervision fees for supervising these lectures for a couple of years before the university got onto the fact that I was breaking the rules. And so we called the supervision seminars and got round it that way. And I didn't get paid for them, of course, once I called them a seminar. But we had a lot of trouble with my paper because I had to share anthropology as the paper with economics. There was a man called Barr who had to do the same and give the same fantastic number of lectures in economics to these cadets in order to keep his pressure up. And he wasn't prepared to change, and none of the cadets seemed to understand his lectures. So they invariably failed the economics questions in the paper, but they always passed mine. So they always got about 50%, which took them through the paper. And we always had a fearful argument at the examiners' meeting, Barr saying these people ought to be failed. People say no, they can't be failed because... Later on, I think they changed it and had a separate paper, but not until very much later, when it became a course on development, and there were no more cadets going out to Africa. But the pattern then was, if you were white, and not a cadet, you qualified in anthropology or took a first degree in anthropology here, and then you migrated to Oxford, where you had EP and Forties, and went on and took a PhD there.
People didn't stay and do PhDs in Cambridge at that time.
Well, there was an unfortunate Indian who was doing a PhD under Hutton, and they failed him, and he only got an MSc or something, which was really bad for him because, of course, his salary was correspondingly reduced when he got back to India.
Yes, you don't know who that was?
I don't remember the name of the unfortunate man. You can check it up in the files. But I took the place here, and that's why they were so anxious to get me, of Evans Pritchard. He had come here as a lecturer after the war, and then he got this Oxford appointment.
As professor?
As professor. And Hutton said to me, you'll be lecturing on Evans Pritchard's special area. I looked up the special area. Africa with special reference to the central region. And I said, well, I'd better go across and see EP in Oxford and see what he's been lecturing about and what he calls central special reference to the central area. And when I saw EP, he said, oh, well, I put it in like that so that I could lecture where I wanted to. You can lecture wherever you wanted to. And I said, well, I can't quite do that because you have already been lecturing to these people on a particular area. And he said, well, it's got to be somewhere in East Africa. And I said, well, can you suggest any books? Because I don't know anything about East Africa. And he said, thought very hard. He said, well, there's the Noor. And then I said, well, any others? He thought again. He said, well, there's the Azande. So I came back, having been stuck with East Africa, and I looked up, I gathered he was lecturing mainly on Uganda. And apart from the Noor and Zandi, I looked up a book written by an agricultural officer on farming in Uganda and lectured off that.
What sort of person was EP? I mean, how did he strike you? You've got to know him a bit more.
EP was very cheerful, easygoing, and I never saw much of him because I was here and he was in Oxford the whole time. But I found him very easy to work with and to talk to and so on. And of course I found him very easy to read. Problem with Fortis was that he lectured all right when you could hear him, but his books were written by a psychologist in that sort of complicated language. Having read the dynamics, I found that I thought hard and said, my God, these are just like the E-bone, but I never thought they were as complicated as that.
Yes. Your mention of Fortis brings up the fact that when you first came here, there was Hutton and
well,
yourself.
There was Hutton and myself.
Was
then
it?
soon after, the university provided a second lecturer, and they appointed Rio Fortune.
Ah, yes.
And then just before he left, there was another lectureship, and because the government kept putting in money to anthropology, and Hutton went and appointed Ethel John Lindgren.
Yes. What, lingering on Fortune for a moment, what sort of are your memories of Rio Fortune? Because he was obviously a distinguished anthropologist.
Well, he was very pleasant socially, but completely bats as far as lecturing or talking about anthropology. His students, I think, had got him taped. They said that he thought in Dabuan.
He'd worked in Dobu.
He'd written this book, Sorcerers of Dabu, and his students said he thinks in Dabuan.
So they couldn't understand his
Well, they used to attend his lectures for a couple of times and then give up. And we merely used to give him some sort of lectureship. We couldn't do anything about him when Fortis came, because he'd been appointed to the retiring age.
What was he like as a colleague in meetings and things like this?
Oh, he'd ask absurd questions, and which had nothing, were quite irrelevant, and he'd start saying something and then think something else and switch on to that without your noticing it. I think he was really slightly mad, because he never wrote anything, and he never lectured anything, and then he created a lot of trouble in other departments by attending their lectures, and then at the end asking damn fool questions, and the lecturer couldn't be sure whether the man was trying to pull his leg or was asking something really random.
This was after he retired, was it? Or
no, this was while he was still here, because he had nothing to do, because nobody wanted him to supervise, and nobody went to his lectures. He'd give lectures for a couple of times, and then nobody being there, he'd not bother to turn up for the rest.
And then was he retired gracefully, and later on, I mean, early retirement or what?
No, you couldn't. It wasn't early retirement. You couldn't retire.
So he continued.
Eventually, he retired when he was due to retire, and not before.
I wonder how they came to appoint him. Did they not know about his reputation for madness?
He had a very good reputation, or at least Hutton accepted it as such. I don't know. I never asked Fortis about it, and I don't think Fortis has ever consulted about him. But you see, the whole idea was to have somebody lecturing in Melanesian. And having Fortune here meant that our students, if they wanted to do anything on Melanesia, gravitated to the LSE and went to Firth, of course.
To escape from Fortune.
Well, we had nobody who would teach it.
At the end of, I think Hutton retired in about 51, was it?
I can't remember now. I have a terrible
49.
memory for dates.
Around that time, there was when he retired, there was a legendary farewell party, wasn't there, for him?
There were all sorts of parties for him.
What?
Because we used to have parties on the river in which we, with the students, there weren't so many students in those days, of course, in which we lashed two canoes together, and Geoffrey Bushnell, who's curator, lent us objects from the museum that were expendable. And we played at throwing Australian boomerangs and so on. The boomerangs weren't quite so successful because they're made of wood that sinks. We didn't know that. And we spent a long time diving into the river trying to recover some of them.
So a few museum
And we
objects.
also had a party at the Green Man, which is the one you were thinking of, which was referred to in the Prince of Wales's talk, I think.
Yes, that's right. What was notable about that?
Well, everybody came in costumes. I came in one of these masquerade costumes, and other people came in costumes. And Ethel John Lindgren was there, and she brought her husband, who kept lassoing people the way lap hunters do, or lap herders do.
Yes, that must have been tremendous fun. So this is about the time Maya comes in 1950. Did you get to do any more field work after you'd come back to become an anthropologist?
Well, after I came back, my first assignment was a parliamentary one. I was appointed as sole commissioner to go to Basutoland to inquire into ritual murders, which the British press were advertising in a big way. Before I went, she was round, my wife was rung up, and they said, "Is your husband is a detective?"
Come on, Ursula's going to join us for this bit.
Join us for this bit.
Because it was obviously Ursula who was rung up.
Well, you were rung up. What did they say to you on the phone?
They said to me, it was the Express or something, just didn't say who they were. Is your husband a Sherlock? And I said no and put the receiver down. And next day there was a headline in the Express saying, "Wife says no Sherlock." But we were rung up. I was rung up a great deal.
Now the other heading was "Sherlock Jones fights voodoo." Was the next heading.
And another longer article in a more respectable paper was instead of punting his family down the Cam, Sherlock Jones will be whatever it was, They loved it. It was very dramatic.
But what was the cause of all this?
Well, the cause of all this was that there was a lodge in Basutoland. They had an absurd system whereby you kept proliferating chieftainships the whole time. More and more were being appointed, and some people were having their land being divided up, their territory being divided up and given to smaller ones and so on. And this had led to people fighting for position, and the only way left to fight was magically. And the magic they were using was medicines, and the medicines had to be obtained from, had to have human power in them, and you got the human ingredients, extracted them from some unfortunate who was killed, but you had to extract them from him while he was still alive. And they had a lot of these, and it built right up until it got to the chiefs right at the top of the list. And I had to go out and write a report on this and suggest what could be done.
What was your report?
Well, my report was that it was happening, and that this was the situation, and until the situation was remedied, it was likely to go on, unless because they could not easily obtain a conviction. They had been obtaining convictions, but they'd used the evidence of people who were alleged to be involved in it, and these were said to be unreliable or something of that sort.
Supergrasses.
And also they couldn't get people to otherwise admit to having done it, because they were all sworn to forget all about it.
It's very gruesome, because they wanted something to cure blindness.
I can sort that one out. Now, this was a very good example of magic, if you like. One particular medicine was obtained. They wanted to get a man off who was being tried for one of these ritual murders, so they committed another one to obtain the right medicine to make the judge blind and pleased with the prisoner and blind to what he'd done. And in order to do this, they had to have somebody from the Sia tribe or clan, Sia being a Soto word for smooth over and make easy, and stop the trouble. And he had to be blind to make the judge blind to the offence, and they managed to track down and murder an unfortunate old blind seer woman. That sort of thing. But the murders were always made to look as though they were accidents too. That was another thing. And the participants afterwards were put through a medicinal arrangement which made them forget all about the action, so that if they should come to court they couldn't give any evidence.
What happened afterwards? Did it die down, or?
It died down. It faded out gradually. But what happened was it died down also because the chief protagonist for the Basutoland chieftainship, or at least he was backing somebody else, he got hung for one of these ritual murders.
What was this about the House of Commons having bits of bodies or whatever?
Well, all that happened was somebody said that it was the most lurid document that was ever laid on the floor of the House of Commons.
Your report?
My report, which listed 100 or more of these horrible crimes, giving details.
Were you ever in danger at all? Or?
Oh no, not at all. It was a very interesting episode. And I was able to help the Basutoland government out to some extent by explaining what was meant by native administration. Because their previous High Commissioner, before he'd been wafted on to be governor of the Gold Coast, had introduced native administration into Basutoland, and nobody knew what the hell it meant. Having come from Nigeria, I was able to explain to them something about it.
How long did you spend in that?
I spent about 4 months or so, working pretty hard and covering the whole area and getting a very good idea of Basutoland. And I worked like mad to get my report written while I was on the boat going back. And then I discovered why you appoint these commissions. The idea is to damp things down and create a pause, a suitable pause, where you can say we can't say anything about it now because it's a commission of inquiry is going into it. Then when interest in the subject in the press has died down, then you publish a report, but not till then.
Yes, as with the Guinness takeover.
What is happening, you'll see it all the time, but I was new to it then, and I wrote my report in a hurry, and then was very surprised to find it wasn't published for another year.
Yes.
And of course some of these reports, they sit on them indefinitely.
So you then came, this was 1950, you came back, and Meyer Fortis was then appointed, well, around that time, appointed professor. What sort of person was he?
Well, he had a very raw deal here, because he came here and he found that I was the only able-bodied lecturer in social anthropology he'd got. He'd got one crazy man called Rio Fortune, and he'd got a woman who was hard at work with her husband introducing reindeer into Scotland and never got anywhere else.
Ethel John Lindgren.
Ethel John Lindgren. And he didn't know what the hell to do about it, and he formed the opinion that he would have to get rid of Lindgren because she had only just been appointed and hadn't come up to 3 years when you were confirmed. And when her confirmation came up, he felt he would have to do the unfortunate thing of saying that she shouldn't be continued, she'd be dismissed. And this created a hell of a furor, as you can imagine. Because you know our faculty board, it contains all sorts of people who have nothing to do with social anthropology. The archaeologists, the teaching archaeologists backed us. All the others, and anybody else who had, and the physical anthropologists, backed Ethel John. And the whole place was completely divided. And the faculty board, when they sat on it, and it included people like Noel Annan, who's now moved on to higher realms, decided, well, they would give her a trial and they'd attend her lectures. And they did. And we gave her a course of lectures on religion, I think it was. And they went something like this. Today we're going to speak about animism. Then she gave a definition of animism. Now the Northern Toongoos do this, and the rest of the lecture waffle about Northern Toongoos. Then the second lecture, next time. Today we're going to talk about spirit possession. Now the Northern Toongoos. And so it went on. And that convinced any little sane-minded person that Fortis had no option but to get rid of her. But people wouldn't speak to each other on the board for quite a long time after that. And I was secretary and I had to take the full weight of it.
Oh, it must have been very traumatic.
It was very funny in many ways.
But did you like Meyer as a person? Was he a good colleague? Or?
I liked Meyer. Of course, what Meyer did, which didn't help him, he consulted his co-professor Dorothy Garrett, not knowing that she was a boon companion of Lindgren.
Oh, I see.
Which didn't help him.
No. Then this was sometime in the 50s, perhaps it was a bit later, the department began to expand in size, didn't it?
Yes.
Even more.
Well, the department expanded in size for one simple reason, I think, and that is that the schools and other people ceased to be interested in classics, and the number of people offering classics here went right down. And as classics went down, a lot of people had to find some other art subject, which didn't include maths, which they could offer. And that's why we had so many girls reading anthropology. I asked one of my students at Newnham, why did you want to read anthropology? She said, well, I didn't want to read anthropology. When I came up, I wanted to read history. But they told me their history quota was full. I was up to the standard, and if I wanted to come, they'd accept me, but I would have to read something else. And they offered me geography, one or two other things, estate management, anthropology. And so I read anthropology. And I also had a number of classicists reading anthropology who transferred from classics because they found it so dull. They said at Oxford, once you've got through the texts in classical moderations, you then go on to philosophy and interesting things, but in Cambridge it's still the books. And we find anthropology as study of living people far more interesting. But there was a general swing, and we gradually increased from 3 or 4 or 5 to a very large number as the cadets sort of faded out.
The people who came were very distinguished. I'm not sure in what order they came. Perhaps Edmund Leach, was he the first, or was it Audrey Richards who first came in to swell
but wait a minute. Edmund, Fortis tried to get Edmund and eventually successfully managed to wean him away from the LSE and bring him here.
Yes.
Audrey would have liked to have been taken on here, but she felt that Fortis was opposed to it. I think she was wrong. I think the reason for that was that Fortis was bringing Goody in here and couldn't get another Africanist. And when he got another Africanist, either Audrey wasn't about or he got, what's his name?
Ray
Abrahams. But she was always on the side here and supervised for Newnham, but was never asked to lecture here or refused to lecture if she was asked.
Really? She didn't lecture?
No. You look through the books and so on, she might have given an occasional honorary lecture or something like that, but she never gave a course of lectures here because I don't think she was attached in that way.
That's interesting. I do remember now that she ended up as Smuts reader.
They made her a Smuts reader, and that helped a lot, and after that we probably brought her in. Because then, of course, anthropology had expanded a great deal, and we were also having this SNA, or whatever this other degree is, in which you have philosophy and anthropology and history and God knows what else on a course.
What was your recollections of Audrey? Did you get on well with her?
Oh, we liked Audrey very much, but I didn't see much of her until her retirement, really, when she was here.
She seemed very perceptive and...
Oh, she was a magnificent person and a very good anthropologist, and where one met her primarily was at these social anthropology meetings a great deal.
Yes,
But we never met her teaching because she didn't.
What about Jack? How did you get on with Jack?
Quite well. Jack, I read both of Jack's. I was an examiner for his, whatever it was, BSc or whatever it was he got at Oxford.
On the Lodegar.
On the Lodegar, and then I examined him again on the death, property and the ancestors. And we got on quite well with him. It was the friction occurred between from the part of Edmund Leach, of course, who felt that Jack was Fortes's Elisha, and that he was left out in the cold, and presented that, but that got cured a bit as soon as they gave him an honorary professorship or whatever.
Yes.
Personal
A personal chair.
Personal chair.
Yes, it was a notorious opposition between Fortes and Leach, both intellectually and emotionally and in many ways. How did you find Edmund Leach?
Oh, I got on. I liked him, and I admired his lectures and his style and that. And he did a lot for the department, of course. He built up all the Southeast Asian studies, and taking all those people to Ceylon put that very nicely on the anthropological map.
Yes, and he presumably was behind Tambaya coming as well, was he?
I think he was, yes.
And you knew S.J. Tambaya?
Well, I knew him and liked him again. No, we had a very happy time once we'd got rid of Ethel-John. There was a little bit of friction between, on the part of Leach. I remember, oh yes, I remember, should I put this on?
Yes, yes.
I remember a famous occasion. As you know, it's only recently that anthropologists have begun again to take senior doctorates.
Yes.
E.P. and Fortes and people like that refused to take them because they were given by Oxford to Meek and other people who they felt weren't proper anthropologists. And then Jack Goody put in for one.
SCD.
For a senior doctorate,
yes.
An SCD, where you wear red gowns
yes.
and what's known in front, purple in front, or heliotrope. And Leach exploded at the meeting. He said, well, who the hell is going to examine him? And so Fortes suggested Shapiro. And Shapiro wasn't getting caught on this one. He wrote back and said that he was not prepared to examine him because the salary, the fee that he would get for it would be far too small considering the volume of books that he would have to read.
But they did find someone because...
Well, they found something, and Jack got his, quite rightly got his senior doctorate. And so were the others that they'd put in for it. But they couldn't find anybody who was a senior doctor, of course, because there weren't any. Because Meek had died. And Meek certainly wouldn't have been capable of examining him anyway.
Were there any students who you taught who you particularly have either become very distinguished anthropologists or anything else, or you particularly remember?
Well, various. I taught a very large number of the whole bunch of them that have gone out from here that went to Africa at all. I didn't have anything to do much in their latter years, their second years, with the Indian ones and the Southeast Asians.
So what sort of people? Jean Lafontaine?
Well, Jean Lafontaine was one. There was a famous occasion when I set her an essay on Melanesian kinship and said she should refer to the sexual life of savages for getting data. She came very red-faced to me the next day and said she'd been to the UL to try and get the book out. And apparently it's in the banned books section. And they wouldn't give it her unless she got a certificate from her tutor saying that she wanted it for academic purposes.
Those were the days.
Those were the days. It's still there.
Yeah, probably is, yes. So there was Jean and some other Africanist.
Jean and that chap who's just died in Australia. What's his name? Something...
Barn.
No. there was a terrible business. He just managed to get his first, because if he didn't get his first, he would have lost his research grant. And he suddenly fell in love with a girl who was also reading anthropology, and she didn't get anything because she walked out of all the exams. She was so overcome by falling in love with him.
Yes.
What was the man's name?
Well, we'll come back to
He'll
him.
come back to it. I can't
Yes.
remember the name, but he went to Australia, and one of the many Australian people.
And he's died.
He's died since.
Yes.
Saw him. He had his obituary in the Times.
Did you teach the Stratherns, Marilyn
Yes.
and
Well,
Andrew?
to some extent I
But they
did. They again went to New Guinea, and so I didn't teach them in latter years, no.
Yes.
I didn't. Taught Abrahams to some extent too.
Ray Abrahams. Yes. Well, I think.
But I taught a whole lot of other people. William Watson, did you ever hear of him?
Oh yes, Manchester School.
Manchester School. Well, he was wished on to me when I first came here by the senior tutor of Jesus, who said, I've got somebody here, he's an ex-air pilot and I can't do anything with him. He's completely hopeless. Can you take him over? And I taught him, and he never looked back.
No, he was a small Scotsman.
Small, little Glaswegian.
With a liking for
I don't know whether he came from the Gaubles, but he was very, he was very full of himself. A tiny little Scotsman.
Yes, I remember him. Willem, I think that we're just coming to the end of our tape. I think it would be nice if Ursula just came over.
Sherry.
Ursula, come and join Willem just for the last minutes, for about 1 minute. Ursula, have you ever regretted being married to an anthropologist?
No, I can't think of anything more interesting. It was quite interesting being married to someone with 3 careers, as I now see it.
What is the third?
Well, he now calls himself a Grandin art historian, and he is very much appreciated in America, that's the point.
Yes.
I love all his American admirers. They've become great friends, and it's good to be able to go on doing something which is new and yet connected with your first hobby.
So you've been to America, haven't you, Willem?
Oh, I've been to America. They borrowed all my photographs for an exhibition they had in California, connection with Igbo art. They spell Igbo with a G there, and they have a number of so-called art historians. And an art historian in America can talk about West African and other primitive art, although it has no history, but you still call yourself a historian.
Well,
You write books about it, and it's really ethnography.
Yes. Well, it's clear you could make a fortune by going on lecture tours around America, but it's delightful that you're still enormously active, and it's clear that one of the things that keeps you so active is your very active wife. So I'd like to thank both of you very much indeed for talking to us.
Well, I hope before I die that I'll have left a photographic collection here that I'm now building up.
And we can integrate that later into the films. Is there anything you want to ask, Sarah?
Good.
Good. Thank you very much indeed.